Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to drift into one of the most peaceful and fascinating journeys in history. A journey that begins long before the United States existed. So, settle into your favorite spot, get comfortable, maybe pull up a blanket, and let your mind slowly wander back through thousands of years. There's nothing you need to do right now except relax and listen as history unfolds at a calm, gentle pace. Imagine a world without highways, without cities, without skyscrapers, and without a country called America. The night is quiet. The stars stretch from one horizon to the other. A cool breeze moves softly through endless forests. Rivers flow exactly as they have for thousands of years, untouched by bridges or factories, carrying crystal clear water across a land that seems almost endless. If you could stand here, you wouldn't hear engines or airplanes. Instead, you'd hear the distant call of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the gentle splash of water against smooth stones, and the comforting crackle of a small campfire glowing beneath the night sky. Now, let history slowly begin. More than 15,000 years ago, the world looked very different from the one we know today. Massive sheets of ice covered much of what is now Canada and reached deep into the northern parts of North America. The climate was colder. The oceans were lower. Because so much water was locked inside enormous glaciers, a vast stretch of land connected Asia and North America. Today, historians call this land Beringia. It wasn't a bridge built by people. It was a natural landscape of open grasslands, rolling hills and frozen plains stretching farther than the eye could see. Across this quiet land walked small groups of families. They weren't explorers searching for a new continent. They weren't trying to make history. They were simply following the animals that helped them survive. Huge herds of mammoths slowly crossed the frozen grasslands. Ancient bison grazed peacefully. Wild horses wandered across the open plains. Generation after generation, people followed these animals, moving only as fast as nature allowed. Each sunrise meant another chance to find food. Each sunset meant gathering together around a warm fire. Life moved gently with the seasons. There were no calendars, no clocks. Only the rising sun, the changing moon, and the endless stars guiding people through the night. Children learned by watching their parents. Hunters studied footprints pressed into soft earth. Elders remembered which rivers stayed full during dry seasons, and which valleys offered shelter during harsh winters. Knowledge wasn't written inside books. It lived inside stories. Every evening, families gathered around glowing fires while older generations shared memories that had been passed down for hundreds of years. Those stories became maps. They became lessons. They became history itself. Slowly, over thousands of years, these communities spread across the continent. Some settled beside wide rivers filled with fish. Others built homes near peaceful lakes surrounded by forests. Farther south, warmer climates allowed families to remain in one place for longer periods of time. Every region taught different lessons. Dense forests rewarded patience. Open plains favored skilled hunters. Mountain valleys offered protection. Coastal waters provided endless seafood. The land itself became the greatest teacher anyone could ever know. As centuries quietly passed, hundreds of unique cultures appeared across North America. Each community developed its own language, its own traditions, its own beliefs, its own way of understanding the natural world. Some people became remarkable canoe builders, crafting graceful wooden boats that moved almost silently across calm rivers. Others mastered weaving beautiful baskets from natural grasses. Stone tools became more refined. Pottery became stronger and more colorful. Trade routes slowly connected distant communities. Beautiful shells traveled hundreds of miles inland. Copper from the Great Lakes reached villages far away. Dias traveled alongside these valuable goods, new farming techniques, new artistic designs, new traditions. History continued to unfold slowly, peacefully, one generation at a time. Long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon, North America was already home to thriving civilizations, rich traditions, and countless stories waiting to be remembered. And beneath the same stars shining above us tonight, those stories quietly began. The first light of morning slowly spread across the eastern horizon. A soft golden glow touched the tops of towering pine trees before gently reaching the valleys below. Mist drifted across quiet rivers, moving so slowly that it almost seemed frozen in time. The air was cool and fresh. Birds welcomed the new day with calm, familiar songs that had echoed across these forests for thousands of years. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, life gently awakened. Smoke began rising from small cooking fires. Children stepped outside their homes, laughing quietly as they greeted another peaceful morning. Hunters prepared their bows with careful hands, checking each arrow before beginning the day's journey. Nearby, women and elders gathered baskets woven from strong natural fibers, ready to collect berries, herbs, nuts, and other foods that the forests generously provided. Nobody rushed. Life followed the steady rhythm of nature. The changing seasons decided when to plant. The rivers decided when fish would return. The forests decided when fruits became ripe. People simply learned to listen. For these communities, the land was never something to conquer. It was something to respect. Every river carried life. Every forest offered shelter. Every mountain reminded people how small they truly were beneath the endless sky. Many families believed that every living thing carried its own spirit. The deer running through the woods, the eagle soaring high above the clouds, the giant oak standing quietly for hundreds of years. Even the rivers themselves seemed alive, flowing endlessly toward places no one had ever seen. These beliefs encouraged people to hunt carefully. Animals were never taken carelessly. Hunters understood that one successful hunt meant another family could survive the coming winter. Before and after many hunts, quiet ceremonies showed gratitude for the gift of life that nature had provided. To modern eyes, this way of thinking might seem unusual, yet it helped create a balance between people and the world around them for countless generations. As centuries quietly passed, knowledge continued growing. People discovered which plants could heal wounds. Some herbs eased headaches, others reduced fever. Tree bark, roots, flowers, and leaves all became part of an impressive understanding of medicine built through observation and experience. There were no hospitals, no pharmacies. Nature itself became the first doctor. At the same time, farming slowly transformed many regions. One remarkable crop became especially important. Today we know it simply as corn. But thousands of years ago, maize represented something extraordinary. It allowed villages to stay in one place for longer periods. Food could be stored for winter. Families became larger. Communities became stronger soon. Farmers learned another important lesson. Beans climbed naturally up tall corn stalks. Squash spread across the ground below, helping the soil stay cool and moist. Together, these three crops supported one another perfectly. Today, historians call them the Three Sisters. Long before modern science explained ecosystems, these farmers already understood that nature worked best through cooperation. Harvest season became a joyful time. Families gathered together beneath warm autumn skies. Fresh corn dried in the sunlight. Pumpkins rested beside neatly woven baskets. Children helped wherever they could, learning skills that one day they would teach their own children. As evening arrived, fires illuminated villages with a warm orange glow. Music filled the cool night air. Drums echoed softly across open fields. Voices joined together in songs that celebrated family, gratitude, and the changing seasons. Stories remain one of the most treasured traditions. An elder might begin speaking while everyone listened quietly. Some stories explained how rivers were formed. Others described great animals that once roamed the earth. Many taught important lessons about courage, kindness, patience, and wisdom. Although the words changed slightly from one generation to the next, the heart of each story remained the same. History survived through memory. Across North America, every region developed differently. Far to the southwest, people built remarkable homes from adobe bricks made of clay and straw dried beneath the hot desert sun. These buildings stayed surprisingly cool during scorching summer afternoons. Ingenious irrigation canals carried precious water across dry landscapes, allowing crops to flourish where little rain ever fell. Meanwhile, deep within the eastern woodlands, forests stretched for hundreds of miles. Towering maple, Oak and pine trees created endless green canopies above peaceful rivers. Here, skilled canoe builders shaped enormous tree trunks into elegant boats capable of traveling long distances. These waterways became the highways of ancient America. Travel that might have taken weeks on foot became much easier by canoe. Trade expanded. Friendships formed between distant communities. Ideas continued flowing as steadily as the rivers themselves. Farther south, warm coastal waters provided fish, oysters, and crabs in great abundance. Families understood the tides. They knew exactly when shellfish could be gathered safely. Generations spent lifetimes learning every detail of the coastline. Nothing was wasted. Every resource had value. Animal hides became clothing. Bones became tools. Wood became homes. Stone became axes, knives, and arrowheads. Nature provided everything necessary for life. Time quietly continued its endless journey. Hundreds of years became thousands. Entire civilizations rose and flourished across the continent. Some communities grew into impressive towns with broad gathering spaces and carefully planned neighborhoods. Visitors arrived from distant lands carrying gifts, stories, and traditions. One of the greatest cities of ancient North America slowly emerged near the Mississippi River. Today we call it Cahokia. At its height, thousands upon thousands of people called it home. Great earthen mounds rose above the landscape. Wide plazas welcomed ceremonies and celebrations. Markets bustled with traders exchanging copper, shells, pottery, and finely crafted tools. To someone arriving from a distant village, Cahokia must have seemed astonishing. Yet despite its size, life still followed the peaceful rhythm of sunrise and sunset. Children still laughed. Families still shared meals. Stories still gathered everyone around evening fires. And while these remarkable civilizations continued growing across North America, something unexpected was beginning far beyond the eastern horizon. Across a vast ocean, kingdoms in Europe were changing. Shipbuilders experimented with larger vessels. New maps slowly appeared. Curiosity about distant seas continued growing with every passing generation. No one on either side of the Atlantic Ocean could possibly imagine that their worlds would soon meet. When they finally did, history would change forever. But for now, the forests remained peaceful. The rivers flowed gently toward the sea, and beneath another sky filled with countless stars, ancient America slept quietly through one more calm and beautiful night. Night slowly gave way to another peaceful morning. A light breeze moved gently through the tall trees, carrying the fresh scent of pine, wildflowers, and damp earth after a cool night. The rivers continued their endless journey toward the sea, just as they had for thousands of years. Nothing seemed hurried. Nothing seemed out of place. For countless generations, the people of North America had learned that patience was one of nature's greatest lessons. The seasons always returned. The stars always found their places in the night sky. The rivers never forgot where they were going. Life was built around those quiet certainties. As the years became centuries, knowledge continued to grow. Parents taught their children not only how to survive, but how to observe. A young child might spend hours watching a beaver build its lodge. Another might learn to recognize dozens of bird calls before reaching adulthood. Hunters could often tell which animal had passed simply by studying a single footprint pressed into soft ground. Nothing in nature was ignored. Everything had something to teach. In many communities, winter evenings were especially important. The days were shorter. Snow covered the forests. Travel became difficult. Families stayed close together inside warm homes while fires crackled softly nearby. These long nights became the perfect time for storytelling. Grandparents spoke of ancestors whose names had been remembered for generations. They told stories about courage during harsh winters, about wise leaders who settled disagreements peacefully, and about mysterious events that reminded everyone to respect the natural world. History wasn't written on paper. It lived inside voices. Each storyteller became a living library. Every generation accepted the responsibility of remembering. Across the eastern woodlands, forests seemed endless. Towering oak, maple, chestnut, and hickory trees covered the landscape. Deer wandered quietly beneath their branches. Black bears searched for berries before winter arrived. Wild turkeys crossed open meadows as morning sunlight filtered through the leaves. Farther west, enormous grasslands stretched beyond the horizon. Millions of bison traveled across these open plains. The ground itself sometimes trembled beneath the weight of their great herds. For many nations living there, the bison became the center of daily life. Its meat provided food. Its hide became warm clothing and strong shelter. Its bones became useful tools. Even its sinew was carefully used to make bows and thread. Very little was ever wasted. Respect for nature remained one of life's greatest principles. Meanwhile, along the Pacific coast, towering cedar forests overlooked the ocean. Massive trees allowed skilled craftsmen to carve beautiful canoes capable of carrying entire families across coastal waters. Some were decorated with detailed artwork representing family history, important animals, or spiritual traditions. Fishing villages flourished beside rivers where salmon returned every year. Entire communities celebrated these seasonal migrations, knowing that nature had once again provided for them. Far to the south, remarkable cities continued rising beneath warm skies. Engineers designed canals that carried water across dry land. Builders carefully placed thousands of stones without modern machinery. Farmers cultivated fields with impressive skill despite challenging climates. These achievements required careful planning, cooperation, and patience. Although separated by great distances, many societies across North America shared one important belief: the future depended upon caring for the land today. This idea shaped daily life in ways that might seem unfamiliar in the modern world. People harvested only what they needed. They observed the changing weather. They watched the movements of birds. They noticed subtle changes in rivers and forests long before anyone else might have recognized them. Nature was both classroom and teacher. As centuries quietly passed, trade networks expanded farther than ever before. A shell gathered near the Gulf Coast might eventually travel hundreds of miles north. Copper mined near the Great Lakes could appear in distant villages many seasons later. Obsidian from western mountains became prized for its incredibly sharp edges. Travelers carried more than goods. They carried songs, languages, ideas, stories, friendships. The continent slowly became connected through countless peaceful exchanges. Yet beyond the endless Atlantic Ocean, another story was beginning. Europe was changing. Powerful kingdoms competed with one another. Cities became larger. Universities preserved ancient knowledge. Merchants dreamed of finding faster trade routes to Asia. Spices, silk, precious metals, and valuable goods inspired explorers to imagine distant oceans they had never crossed. New technologies slowly transformed shipbuilding. Ships became stronger. Their sails became more efficient. Compasses helped sailors travel farther from familiar coastlines. Maps, although still incomplete, gradually improved as each voyage revealed something new. For many Europeans, the Atlantic Ocean remained mysterious. Some feared sea monsters. Others believed the endless water simply stretched forever. Few imagined that another vast continent waited beyond the horizon. Back in North America, life continued peacefully. Children chased one another through open fields. Farmers prepared next season's crops. Craftsmen carved wood with remarkable precision. Women wove beautiful baskets strong enough to last for years. The stars appeared once again as another evening settled across the forests. Nobody knew that change was quietly approaching. Far away, in busy European ports, ambitious sailors studied maps beneath flickering candlelight. Kings and queens listened carefully as advisors spoke about new trade routes. Shipyards echoed with the sound of hammers shaping timber into vessels larger than any built before. The distance between two worlds remained enormous. Yet with every passing year, that distance grew a little smaller. The winds across the Atlantic carried ships farther than ever before. The ocean that had separated civilizations for thousands of years was slowly becoming a pathway instead of a barrier. Soon, one voyage would begin that generations of historians would remember forever. It would not unfold exactly as many people imagine today. Its story would include courage, uncertainty, mistakes, hope, and consequences that would shape centuries to come. But that voyage had not yet begun. For now, the forests remained calm. The rivers continued flowing beneath the moonlight. Campfires glowed softly beneath countless stars. And across the quiet continent, another peaceful night embraced a land that had no idea history was about to change forever. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. Gentle waves rolled across the water, sparkling like countless tiny pieces of glass. For thousands of years, this vast ocean had separated continents. On one side lay Europe, filled with ancient kingdoms, castles, busy marketplaces, and growing cities. On the other side rested North America, where forests, rivers, mountains, and thriving indigenous nations had followed their own rhythms for countless generations. Neither world fully understood the other. In Europe during the 1400s, curiosity about distant lands was growing stronger every year. Merchants dreamed of reaching Asia more quickly. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were incredibly valuable. Silk from China amazed wealthy families. Fine porcelain and rare goods traveled thousands of miles before reaching European markets, making them expensive and difficult to obtain. Most trade routes crossed long stretches of land controlled by many different kingdoms and empires. Every border meant new taxes, new risks, and new delays. Many rulers began asking an important question: could there be another way? If ships could sail west across the Atlantic and somehow reach Asia, trade might become faster and far more profitable. It was a bold idea. At the time, no one in Europe knew that two enormous continents stood between them and Asia. Sailors understood that the Earth was round, a fact educated Europeans had accepted for centuries, but they greatly underestimated just how large the planet truly was. Maps of the world still contained many blank spaces. Some coastlines were only rough guesses. Large areas simply carried notes like unknown. Every voyage added another small piece to the puzzle. Meanwhile, improvements in navigation slowly made longer journeys possible. The magnetic compass helped sailors maintain direction even when clouds covered the stars. The astrolabe allowed experienced navigators to estimate their position using the sun and stars. New ship designs, especially the nimble caravel, handled strong ocean winds more effectively than older vessels. These advances did not remove danger. The sea remained unpredictable. Storms could appear without warning. Towering waves could damage even the strongest ships. Fresh drinking water often became scarce during long voyages. Food spoiled. Disease spread easily among cramped crews. Even under calm seas, weeks at sea demanded patience and courage. In the busy ports of Portugal and Spain, shipbuilders worked from sunrise until sunset. The steady rhythm of hammers echoed across the docks. Sails were stitched by skilled hands. Barrels of food and fresh water were carefully loaded aboard waiting ships. Experienced sailors exchanged stories about powerful currents, shifting winds, and mysterious islands reported by earlier voyages. Some tales were true. Others grew a little more dramatic each time they were told. Still, every story reminded people that the ocean remained full of mystery. Far across that same ocean, life in North America continued peacefully. Villages prepared for another changing season. Farmers watched fields of corn sway gently in the breeze. Children learned ancient traditions from parents and grandparents. Hunters quietly followed well-worn forest trails they knew almost by heart. No one stood watching the eastern horizon expecting unfamiliar ships. The ocean was simply part of the natural world. Its waves arrived. Its tides changed. Its fish provided food. Life continued as it always had. Back in Europe, one sailor had become especially determined. His name was Christopher Columbus. For years, he believed that sailing west across the Atlantic would provide a direct route to Asia. Many people doubted his calculations. Some thought the voyage would be far too long. Others questioned whether enough food and water could ever be carried aboard a ship. Yet Columbus remained convinced that success was possible. He presented his proposal to several rulers before finally receiving support from the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Preparations began slowly. 3 ships were chosen for the journey: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Compared with modern ships, they were surprisingly small. Life aboard them would be crowded. Every inch of space mattered. Supplies were carefully packed. Sails were repaired. ropes inspected, wooden barrels filled with fresh water, dried foods, salted meat, and other necessities. Crew members gathered from many backgrounds. Some were experienced sailors. Others simply hoped the voyage might bring opportunity. None of them truly knew what waited beyond the western horizon. As the summer of 1492 drew to a close, excitement mixed with uncertainty. Families said goodbye along the docks. The ships rocked gently with the tide, seagulls circled overhead. The smell of salt water filled the air. On August 3, 1492, the small fleet finally left the Spanish port of Palos. Their white sails slowly disappeared into the distance. The voyage had begun. Day after day, the ships crossed open water. At first, the crew followed familiar routes, but gradually they sailed farther into parts of the Atlantic few Europeans had ever explored. Weeks passed. The endless ocean surrounded them in every direction. Some sailors grew nervous. Others wondered whether they would ever see land again. The wind remained steady. The waves rolled endlessly beneath the ships. Every sunrise looked much like the one before it. Every sunset painted the sea with beautiful shades of gold, orange, and deep crimson. Above them, the night sky glittered with countless stars, guiding the navigators across the dark ocean. They had no idea that with every passing mile, they were moving toward a meeting between two worlds that had remained separated for thousands of years. And far beyond the horizon, North America rested peacefully beneath another quiet evening, unaware that history itself was slowly sailing closer with every gentle wave. For weeks, the three small ships continued their slow journey across the Atlantic. Every morning began in much the same way. The sailors climbed the rigging to adjust the sails. Others inspected ropes that had become damp from the salty sea air. Some cleaned the wooden decks while the ship gently rocked beneath their feet. Life aboard was simple but never easy. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed. Meals were modest, often consisting of hard bread, salted meat, dried beans, cheese, and whatever food had managed to survive the long voyage without spoiling. There was very little privacy. The crews slept wherever they could find space. The constant sound of waves became part of everyday life. During calm weather, the ocean seemed peaceful beyond imagination. The surface shimmered beneath the sunlight, stretching endlessly toward every horizon. Flying fish occasionally leaped above the water. Pods of dolphins sometimes swam alongside the ships, as if welcoming their unexpected visitors. At night, the sea became even more magical. Moonlight painted silver paths across the water. The stars appeared brighter than most sailors had ever seen. Without the lights of cities, the heavens looked almost endless. Experienced navigators studied familiar constellations to guide the fleet westward. For many crew members, those stars offered comfort. They were the one familiar sight in a world surrounded entirely by water. But as the days turned into weeks, uncertainty slowly began to grow. Some sailors quietly wondered if they had sailed too far. Others worried that the winds carrying them west might never allow them to return home. Rumors spread from one sailor to another. Would they ever see land again? Had they entered an ocean with no end? Christopher Columbus did his best to keep everyone's spirits steady. He remained confident that land lay somewhere ahead. Each day, the crew searched the horizon from sunrise until sunset. Every cloud seemed like it might be a distant coastline. Every shadow on the water raised fresh hope, then disappeared just as quickly. One morning, the sailors noticed floating branches drifting across the sea. Later, they spotted patches of green vegetation. Soon afterward, birds began appearing more frequently. These were encouraging signs. Birds usually stayed closer to land than to the open ocean. Excitement quietly returned. Perhaps the long journey was finally nearing its end. On the evening of October 11, 1492, the atmosphere aboard the ships felt different. The sea was calm. The air carried a sense of expectation. Throughout the night, sailors remained alert, carefully watching the darkness ahead. Then, shortly after midnight, a cry rang out across the water. Land. Far in the distance, a faint outline appeared beneath the moonlight. After more than 2 months at sea, the long voyage had reached its destination. As dawn slowly arrived on October 12, the ships approached a small island surrounded by clear blue water and white sandy beaches. Palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze. The scene looked completely different from the ports of Spain. Bright tropical birds flew overhead. The water near the shore was astonishingly clear. Columbus stepped onto the beach, believing he had reached islands near Asia. He did not realize that he had arrived in a part of the world completely unknown to Europeans. The island was already home to indigenous people. They had lived there for generations. They watched the unfamiliar ships with curiosity. To them, these enormous wooden vessels with towering white sails must have seemed unlike anything they had ever seen. The first meeting between the two worlds was cautious. Neither side understood the other's language. Communication depended on gestures, smiles, and careful observation. The indigenous people welcomed the newcomers with gifts, sharing food, water, and other items as a sign of peace. Columbus and his crew, meanwhile, carefully explored their surroundings, amazed by the warm climate, colorful plants, and unfamiliar wildlife. Although this meeting appeared peaceful, neither group could fully understand how important this moment would become. For the indigenous communities, it was simply the arrival of strangers. For Columbus, it was the beginning of what he believed would be a route to Asia. In reality, it marked the start of a new chapter in world history. Over the following weeks, Columbus explored several nearby islands, continuing to search for wealthy cities and valuable spices that he expected to find. Instead, he encountered landscapes unlike anything described in European books. Dense forests stretched to the coastline. Brilliant flowers bloomed beneath the tropical sun. Clear rivers flowed into quiet bays. Every day revealed something entirely new. Yet one enormous misunderstanding remained. Columbus never realized he had reached continents previously unknown to Europeans. He continued believing he had arrived near Asia. Because of that mistaken belief, the indigenous peoples he met were called Indians, a name that remained in use for centuries despite being historically inaccurate. As the weeks passed, Columbus prepared to return to Spain. He carried with him stories of fertile islands, unfamiliar plants, remarkable wildlife, and lands that seemed full of possibility. News of his voyage would spread quickly across Europe. Kings, queens, merchants, explorers, and ordinary people would soon hear about these discoveries. Many would become eager to launch voyages of their own. The Atlantic Ocean, once viewed as an almost impossible barrier, was rapidly becoming a bridge connecting two very different worlds. And although no one could yet see the future, the years ahead would transform both Europe and the Americas forever. When Christopher Columbus returned to Spain in the spring of 1493, the news spread with incredible speed. Church bells rang in celebration. Crowds gathered to hear stories from the sailors. Royal advisors listened carefully as Columbus described warm islands, friendly people, fertile land, and plants unlike anything found in Europe. Although he believed he had reached islands near Asia, his voyage had opened a doorway to an entirely different world. Across Europe, curiosity quickly turned into excitement. If one expedition had crossed the Atlantic successfully, perhaps many more could do the same. Kings and queens began thinking about trade. Merchants dreamed of new opportunities. Mapmakers hurried to redraw their maps, leaving room for lands that had never appeared on European charts before. Shipbuilders became busier than ever. Every year, new vessels sailed westward, carrying explorers, sailors, priests, merchants, and adventurers. Each voyage returned with new stories. Some described beautiful coastlines stretching farther than anyone expected. Others spoke of vast forests filled with towering trees. Many reported rivers so wide they seemed almost like inland seas. Still, no one fully understood the true size of these newly encountered lands. Some believed they had reached islands. Others imagined they were exploring the outer edges of Asia. The mystery remained unsolved. Meanwhile, life across North America continued much as it always had. In the forests of the East, families planted corn, beans, and squash beneath the warm spring sun. Along the Great Plains, enormous bison herds continued their ancient migrations. On the Pacific coast, fishermen guided graceful cedar canoes through calm coastal waters. The people living across the continent had no way of knowing that more European ships were crossing the Atlantic every year. For many communities, The first sight of these unfamiliar vessels must have been astonishing. Large wooden ships appeared on the horizon like floating islands, their white sails glowing brightly in the sunlight. Some villages welcomed the newcomers with curiosity. Others watched carefully from a distance, unsure of what these strangers intended. Each encounter was different. Sometimes gifts were exchanged. Sometimes food and fresh water were shared. Communication relied almost entirely on gestures, smiles, and patience. Neither side understood the other's language, yet both sides recognized something remarkable. They were meeting people from worlds they had never imagined. As more voyages followed, European explorers slowly realized that these lands were far larger than they had first believed. Coastlines stretched for thousands of miles. New rivers flowed inland farther than expected. Dense forests covered enormous regions. Mountain ranges appeared where maps had once shown only empty space. One explorer who helped change Europe's understanding of the world was an Italian navigator named Amerigo Vespucci. Unlike Columbus, Vespucci carefully studied the coastlines and compared what he observed with existing maps and descriptions of Asia. Gradually, he reached an important conclusion. These lands were not part of Asia at all. They were an entirely separate continent. It was a revolutionary idea. European scholars debated his observations for years. Eventually, a German mapmaker named Martin Waldseemüller published a world map in 1507 on that map. He labeled part of the newly recognized continent America, honoring Amerigo Vespucci's writings. The name slowly spread. At first, it appeared only on certain maps. Over time, more mapmakers adopted it. Eventually, the name America became widely accepted. Back across the Atlantic, exploration continued. European ships mapped more coastlines with every passing year. Some searched for gold, others searched for trade routes. Many simply wanted to discover what lay beyond the next bay, river, or mountain. Nature revealed itself slowly. Towering forests, crystal-clear lakes, powerful waterfalls, rolling hills, vast grasslands stretching farther than the eye could see. Each voyage added another small piece to the growing picture of an enormous continent. But alongside discovery came profound change. New plants, animals, and ideas began moving between Europe and the Americas. Historians now call this exchange the Columbian Exchange. It transformed daily life on both sides of the Atlantic. From the Americas, crops such as corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peppers, and cacao gradually reached Europe. Many Europeans had never seen these foods before. Within generations, they became part of everyday meals across much of the world. From Europe came horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, wheat, and many other plants and animals that had never before existed in the Americas. The horse, in particular, would eventually change life for many indigenous nations living across the Great Plains, making hunting and travel faster and more efficient than ever before. These exchanges reshaped economies, agriculture, and cultures in ways that few people at the time could have imagined. History was entering a new era. The Atlantic Ocean no longer separated two isolated worlds. Instead, it became a busy highway connecting continents through exploration, trade, migration, and the sharing of knowledge. Yet the greatest chapters of America's story were still waiting to unfold. Permanent settlements had not yet transformed the eastern coastline. The famous colonies that would one day become the United States were still years away. For now, the forests remained vast. The rivers continued flowing quietly toward the sea, and beneath another sky filled with countless stars, the continent patiently waited for the next chapter in its extraordinary history. The 16th century unfolded slowly, one voyage at a time. Every spring, more ships departed from European ports, carried westward by steady Atlantic winds. Some captains searched for riches. Others hoped to discover a passage that would lead all the way to Asia. Many simply wanted to explore coastlines that no European map had yet recorded. The ocean remained as beautiful as it was unpredictable. Some voyages crossed beneath bright blue skies, where dolphins leaped through gentle waves and seabirds circled overhead. Others battled fierce storms that darkened the sky for days. Towering waves crashed against wooden hulls. Powerful winds tore at sails and snapped heavy ropes. For sailors, Every successful crossing demanded patience, courage, and a little good fortune. As explorers traveled farther along the eastern coastline of North America, they encountered landscapes unlike anything they had known in Europe. There were endless forests where towering oak, maple, and pine trees seemed to stretch forever. Wide rivers flowed hundreds of miles inland. Freshwater lakes reflected the sky so perfectly that they appeared almost endless. Wildlife was abundant. White-tailed deer moved quietly through the woods. Black bears wandered beneath thick forests. Beavers built remarkable dams across peaceful streams. And in the skies above, bald eagles soared gracefully on rising currents of warm air. To many European visitors, the land appeared almost unimaginably vast, yet it was far from empty. Millions of indigenous people already called these lands home. Hundreds of nations, each with its own language, traditions, and history, lived across the continent. Some communities were small villages tucked beside rivers. Others formed powerful confederacies that governed large territories through diplomacy and cooperation. One of the most remarkable was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to many as the Iroquois Confederacy. Long before the United States existed, its member nations had created a system of cooperation that helped maintain peace among neighboring communities. Leaders gathered to discuss important decisions. Debates often continued until agreement could be reached. Careful listening was considered just as important as speaking. This approach to leadership impressed many visitors who later learned about it. Farther south, other nations developed different ways of life shaped by their environments. Some relied heavily on farming. Others became skilled fishermen. Communities living near the Atlantic coast harvested oysters, clams, and fish from rich coastal waters. Those living deep inland depended on forests, rivers, and fertile fields. Every region offered different opportunities, and every nation adapted with remarkable skill. Meanwhile, European maps slowly became more accurate. Each returning expedition added new details. Bays received names. Rivers were carefully sketched. Dangerous reefs were marked to warn future sailors. What had once been blank spaces gradually filled with coastlines, notes, and observations. Still, enormous portions of North America remained unexplored by Europeans. Beyond the coast lay vast landscapes that few outsiders had ever seen. Dense forests hid winding rivers. Towering mountain ranges waited beyond distant horizons. The continent continued to guard many of its secrets. Back in Europe, stories about the New World captured people's imaginations. Some tales were wonderfully accurate. Others became exaggerated with every retelling. Travelers described forests so large that a person could walk for weeks without reaching the end. They spoke of rivers wider than anything found in Europe. They described unfamiliar animals that seemed almost unbelievable. Beavers with flat tails, turkeys roaming wild, tiny hummingbirds that hovered like living jewels. Many listeners struggled to imagine such places. Yet every new voyage confirmed that these stories were rooted in reality. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer a mystery. It had become a bridge connecting two very different worlds. Trade slowly increased. Ships carried tools, cloth, glass beads, and metal goods westward. On their return journeys, they transported furs, timber, fish, and new crops that were beginning to change European agriculture. Ports that had once seen only occasional voyages now welcomed ships arriving from across the ocean every year. Life on both sides of the Atlantic was changing, often in quiet ways that people barely noticed at the time. Children born in Europe were growing up eating foods that their grandparents had never tasted. Families in the Americas were seeing unfamiliar animals become part of everyday life. Cultures that had developed separately for thousands of years were slowly becoming connected. As the century moved toward its close, another idea began taking shape in England. Unlike Spain, which had focused much of its attention farther south, English leaders started wondering whether permanent communities could be established along the Atlantic coast of North America. Could families build homes there? Could farms flourish? Could entirely new towns grow beside those distant rivers and forests? The questions were simple. The answers would shape history for centuries to come. Before long, English ships would carry not only explorers, but settlers hopping to begin new lives across the Atlantic. Their journey would lead to the first permanent English colony in North America. Its name was Jamestown, and its story, filled with determination, hardship, and resilience, would become one of the most important chapters in the history of what would eventually become the United States. But that is a story for the next quiet evening, as history continues to unfold beneath the same timeless stars that have watched over this remarkable land since the very beginning. The year was 1607. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a pale morning sky. Gentle waves rolled beneath 3 English ships as they slowly sailed toward a coastline no one aboard had ever seen before. Their names were the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. Months earlier, they had departed from England, leaving behind familiar villages, crowded ports, and the lives they had always known. The voyage across the Atlantic had been long and uncertain. Storms had tested both the ships and their crews. Fresh water had been carefully rationed. Food supplies had grown smaller with each passing week. Yet every sunrise brought renewed hope that land lay somewhere beyond the horizon. At last, after more than 4 months at sea, that hope became reality. Early one spring morning, the lookout spotted a distant shoreline. At first, it appeared as little more than a dark green line against the horizon. But as the ships moved closer, the details slowly came into view. Towering forests stretched as far as the eye could see. Wide rivers flowed peacefully toward the sea, birds circled overhead, and the fresh scent of pine drifted across the calm water. For the weary travelers, it was a breathtaking sight. Many stood silently along the decks, taking in the beauty before them. They had crossed an entire ocean to reach a land that seemed untouched and endless. The ships entered a broad bay that would later become known as the Chesapeake Bay. From there, they carefully sailed into a quiet river, which they named the James River in honor of King James I of England. After exploring the shoreline, the settlers selected a small peninsula where deep water allowed their ships to anchor close to land. They believed the location would be easy to defend if danger ever appeared. Soon, the hard work began. Axes echoed through the forest from sunrise until sunset. Large trees were cut down and shaped into sturdy logs. Wooden walls slowly rose around the settlement. Simple houses, storehouses, and workshops began taking shape one careful beam at a time. This small settlement would become known as Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in North America. The settlers worked tirelessly, believing they were building not just a village, but the beginning of an entirely new future. None of them could have imagined that this quiet place beside the James River would one day become one of the most important locations in American history. The first days at Jamestown were filled with optimism. Each morning, the settlers woke to the sound of birds singing in the forests and the gentle movement of the James River beside their camp. Everything around them felt unfamiliar. The trees were taller than many had ever seen. The river seemed wider. The wildlife was unlike anything they had known in England. It was a beautiful land, but it was also a land they did not yet understand. From sunrise until evening, everyone worked. Some chopped down trees. Others built wooden cabins and strengthened the protective wall around the settlement. Carpenters repaired tools damaged during the long voyage. Blacksmiths heated metal over glowing fires, shaping nails, hinges, and farming equipment that the colony desperately needed. Every task mattered. Without shelter, they could not survive the coming winter. Without food, no amount of determination would be enough. The settlers soon realized that the location they had chosen was not as perfect as it had first appeared. The river beside the settlement was affected by the ocean tides. Sometimes the water became too salty to drink. During the hot summer months, mosquitoes filled the marshes surrounding the colony. Many carried diseases that the settlers did not understand. People became weak with fever. Simple illnesses often became life-threatening because medicine at the time was very limited. Finding enough food became another daily challenge. Many of the original settlers had been gentlemen, craftsmen, or merchants. Very few had experienced growing crops or hunting in the wilderness. They had hoped to discover gold or other valuable treasures soon after arriving. Instead, they found themselves spending nearly every hour searching for clean water, gathering food, and building shelter. The reality of life in North America was far different from the dreams many had imagined before leaving England. Fortunately, they were not alone on the land. The region surrounding Jamestown had been home to indigenous peoples for countless generations. The most powerful group in the area was the Powhatan Confederacy, an alliance of more than 30 indigenous nations led by Chief Powhatan. Their villages stretched across much of what is now eastern Virginia. They knew every river, every forest trail, and every changing season. Their farmers grew corn, beans, squash, and other crops that flourished in the fertile soil. Their hunters understood the movements of deer, wild turkey, and countless other animals. Their fishermen harvested the rivers and nearby Chesapeake Bay with remarkable skill. At first, both the English settlers and the Powhatan people observed each other carefully. Neither side fully understood the other's language or customs. Curiosity mixed with caution. Sometimes small trading parties met peacefully. The English offered metal tools, copper kettles, glass beads, and other manufactured goods. In return, the Powhatan shared corn and food that helped the struggling settlement survive. These early exchanges showed that cooperation was possible despite the many differences between the two cultures. Yet misunderstandings also occurred. The English viewed land ownership differently from the Powhatan people. Each side held beliefs shaped by generations of experience. Simple disagreements could quickly become complicated when neither side fully understood the other's traditions. Even so, during these early months, peaceful trade often proved more valuable than conflict. As summer slowly faded into autumn, the settlers hoped the hardest days were behind them. The fields they had planted were beginning to grow. New buildings stood inside the wooden fort. Ships still rested safely along the river. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Jamestown might finally become the successful colony they had dreamed about. But nature had one more difficult test waiting for them. Winter was approaching, and it would become one of the greatest challenges the young colony had ever faced. As autumn faded into winter, the forests around Jamestown changed color. Brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold slowly disappeared as cold winds swept through the trees. The mornings became frosty. The nights grew longer. The settlers gathered around small fires, hoping the warmth would last until sunrise. Winter in Virginia was not as harsh as it could be farther north, but for a struggling colony with limited supplies, even an ordinary winter could become dangerous. By late November, food was already running low. The settlers had expected to harvest more crops than they actually had. Some fields had produced little, others had been neglected, while everyone focused on building the settlement. The stores of grain and dried food grew smaller with each passing week. Every meal became more carefully measured. No one knew exactly when the next supply ship from England would arrive. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the colony. Each morning, small groups left the fort to hunt deer or gather whatever food they could find in the surrounding forests. Sometimes they returned with fish from the river. Occasionally, they were fortunate enough to bring back wild turkey or small game. Other days, they came back with almost nothing. The wilderness was beautiful, but it offered no guarantees. Inside the fort, illness spread quickly. The crowded living conditions made it difficult to stay healthy. Many settlers suffered from fever, infections, or diseases carried by mosquitoes during the warmer months. Without modern medicine, even a minor illness could become life-threatening. Doctors did what they could with the knowledge available at the time, using herbs, simple treatments, and careful observation. But their options were limited. Every loss was deeply felt. The small community depended on every pair of hands. Despite these hardships, the settlers refused to abandon Jamestown. Each sunrise brought another opportunity to improve their chances of survival. They repaired damaged buildings, strengthened the wooden walls, collected firewood before heavy rains arrived. Slowly, they learned which plants could be gathered safely and where fish were most plentiful along the James River. Experience became their greatest teacher. Not far beyond the settlement, the Powhatan Confederacy continued preparing for winter in ways refined over many generations. Their villages stored dried corn and other foods harvested during the autumn. They understood the seasonal rhythms of the land. Years of knowledge helped them face challenges that still seemed unfamiliar to the English settlers. At times, trade between the two groups continued. Corn became especially valuable. For the English, each successful exchange meant precious extra weeks of survival. For the Powhatan people, these encounters required careful judgment. They balanced generosity with concern for their own communities and resources. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, life in England carried on as usual. Families celebrated holidays. Merchants filled busy marketplaces. Most people had little idea how difficult life had become in the distant colony. Letters describing Jamestown's struggles traveled slowly by ship, taking months to cross the ocean. By the time news arrived, conditions in the colony had often changed again. As the first winter slowly came to an end, the settlers looked toward spring with cautious hope. The days gradually became longer. Birdsong returned to the forests. Fresh green leaves appeared on branches that had stood bare through the cold months. Nature quietly reminded everyone that every difficult season eventually gives way to another beginning. Jamestown had survived its first great test. The colony was still small, still fragile, still uncertain about its future, but it remained standing. The settlers had learned an important lesson that would stay with them for years to come. Success in this new land would not come quickly. It would require patience, hard work, cooperation, and the willingness to learn from both the land itself and the people who had called it home for countless generations. With spring arriving once again, fresh ships from England were already preparing to sail across the Atlantic. New settlers, new supplies, and new challenges were on their way. Jamestown's story was only just beginning. Spring arrived with quiet determination. The forests surrounding Jamestown slowly came back to life. Fresh green leaves unfolded across the branches. Wildflowers covered open meadows with soft shades of blue, yellow, and white. The James River reflected the bright morning sky as gentle breezes rippled across its surface. For the settlers, the arrival of warmer weather brought something they had not felt in many months: hope. After surviving a difficult winter, they now had another opportunity to strengthen the colony. Every sunrise marked the beginning of another busy day. Some settlers repaired cabins that had been damaged by wind and rain. Others cleared more land for farming. Trees that had stood for decades were carefully cut down, their timber becoming homes, fences, storehouses, and watchtowers. The steady sound of axes echoed through the forest from morning until evening. This time, however, the settlers approached their work differently. The hardships of the previous year had taught them valuable lessons. Searching for gold could wait. Survival came first. Growing food became the colony's highest priority. Fields of corn slowly expanded. Vegetable gardens appeared beside the wooden houses. Fishing along the James River became part of everyday life. Every successful harvest meant a better chance of surviving the next winter. As the weeks passed, ships from England finally appeared on the horizon. Their white sails brought excitement throughout the settlement. The newcomers carried fresh supplies, tools, seeds, clothing, and additional settlers ready to begin new lives in Virginia. Letters from home were passed from hand to hand for many colonists. Reading words from loved ones they had not seen in months became one of the happiest moments of the year. The arrival of new settlers also brought fresh energy. Carpenters, blacksmiths, farmers, and laborers all contributed their skills. The colony slowly expanded beyond its original boundaries. New buildings rose beside older ones. Footpaths became well-worn streets. The sounds of hammers, saws, and busy conversations filled the growing settlement. Yet Jamestown still depended heavily on its relationship with the surrounding land. The forests provided timber and game. The rivers supplied fish and fresh transportation routes. Nature remained both generous and demanding. Every season required preparation. Every harvest required careful planning. Not far away, the villages of the Powhatan Confederacy continued their own daily routines. Children learned traditional skills from their parents. Farmers tended their fields. Hunters quietly followed familiar trails through the woods. Life moved according to rhythms that had guided their people for countless generations. Although periods of peace continued between the English settlers and the Powhatan people, moments of tension also appeared. As Jamestown expanded, both groups relied on many of the same natural resources. Misunderstandings sometimes arose over trade, land, and expectations. Even so, there were still many days when cooperation proved stronger than conflict. Both communities understood that survival often depended upon wise decisions rather than unnecessary confrontation. Back in England, reports about Virginia inspired more families to consider crossing the Atlantic. The journey remained dangerous. The future remained uncertain. But stories of fertile land and new opportunities encouraged many people to take the risk. Slowly, more settlements began appearing along the eastern coastline. Each colony faced its own unique challenges. Some struggled with harsh weather, others battled disease or food shortages. Yet together, these small communities marked the beginning of England's lasting presence in North America. No one living in Jamestown could have imagined what the next century would bring. The tiny settlement beside the James River would eventually become part of a much larger story. More colonies would be founded. Millions of people would cross the Atlantic. New towns would grow into thriving cities. And the foundations of a future nation would slowly take shape. For now, however, life remained simple. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees. The river flowed quietly past the settlement. Children laughed as they played between the wooden cabins. Farmers worked patiently beneath the warm spring sky. And each peaceful evening ended the same way. As darkness settled over Virginia, countless stars appeared overhead, shining with the same quiet brilliance that had watched over this land for thousands of years. Long before Jamestown, long before England, and long before anyone imagined a country that would one day be called the United States, years passed quietly along the shores of Virginia. Jamestown slowly changed from a fragile outpost into a growing English community. The wooden fort became more organized. New homes appeared one by one. Gardens surrounded many of the cabins. Footpaths widened into busy streets where settlers greeted one another each morning. Life was still difficult, but it had become more predictable. Every season followed a familiar rhythm. Spring meant planting. Summer brought long days of hard work. Autumn was the season of harvest. Winter reminded everyone to prepare wisely and waste nothing. The James River remained the heart of the colony. Small boats traveled up and down its calm waters carrying supplies, food, timber, and messages between settlements. The river connected people just as roads would connect future towns many years later. Along its banks, fishermen cast their nets at sunrise while merchants loaded barrels onto waiting ships. As tobacco farming expanded, the landscape began to change. Fields that had once been dense forests slowly opened into neat rows of crops. The rich soil of Virginia proved ideal for growing tobacco, and demand in England continued to rise. Every ship returning across the Atlantic carried thousands of pounds of carefully packed tobacco leaves. The crop brought prosperity to many settlers. New farms appeared farther inland. Large plantations slowly spread across the countryside. With success came new challenges. Growing tobacco required enormous amounts of labor. The larger the fields became, the more workers were needed to plant, care for, and harvest the valuable crop. In the colony's earliest years, much of this work was done by indentured servants. These were men and women who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage from England to America, along with the promise of land or wages once their contracts ended. Many endured long days of difficult work with the hope of building a better future. Their lives were often demanding, yet many believed the sacrifice would eventually bring new opportunities. In 1619, another event took place that would have a lasting impact on American history. A ship arrived in Virginia carrying the first recorded group of Africans brought to the English colony. This moment marked the beginning of a tragic chapter that would grow into the system of racial slavery in English North America over the following decades. At first, labor systems were complex and changed over time. But eventually millions of African men, women, and children would be forced into slavery, denied their freedom, and separated from their families. Their strength, skills, and resilience helped build farms, towns, roads, and eventually much of the young colony's economy. Their stories are an essential part of American history and are remembered today with honesty and respect. That same year, 1619, another important event quietly unfolded in Jamestown. Representatives from different settlements gathered inside a small wooden church. Together, they formed the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in English North America. For the first time, elected representatives met to discuss local laws and the needs of the colony. The gathering was modest. The building was simple. No one there could know that this small meeting would become an early step in the long development of representative government in what would eventually become the United States. Across the Atlantic, England continued watching its American colonies with growing interest. Each successful harvest encouraged more families to make the difficult journey west. Ships arrived carrying carpenters, blacksmiths, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. Some hoped to own land. Others sought religious freedom or economic opportunity. Each arrival added another thread to the growing story of English America. Yet beyond Virginia, the continent remained immense. Vast forests still stretched across thousands of miles. Towering mountain ranges stood beyond the horizon. Great rivers flowed through lands that most Europeans had never seen. Hundreds of indigenous nations continued living according to traditions that reached back countless generations. North America was still a land of extraordinary diversity. As evening settled over Jamestown once again, smoke drifted gently from the chimneys of wooden homes. Children chased one another through the village before returning inside for supper. Boats rocked quietly along the riverbank. The day's work was finished. Above the colony, the stars slowly filled the night sky, the same stars that had watched over the first indigenous communities, the same stars that had guided explorers across the Atlantic. Now shone peacefully over a small English settlement whose future would become deeply woven into the history of an entire nation. And while Virginia continued to grow, another group of English settlers was already preparing for a voyage farther north, a journey that would lead to one of the most famous settlements in American history. Their destination would become known as Plymouth. The autumn of 1620 arrived quietly along the coast of England. In the busy harbor of Plymouth, a modest wooden ship rested gently on the water. Its name was the Mayflower. Compared with the enormous ships of today, the Mayflower was quite small. It measured only about 100 feet in length, yet it was preparing to carry more than 100 passengers across one of the world's most unpredictable oceans. The people boarding the ship came from different backgrounds. Some were skilled craftsmen, some were farmers, others were merchants or laborers hopping to build better lives. Among them was a group of English Protestants, often remembered today as the Pilgrims. They wanted greater freedom to practice their religion according to their own beliefs. For them, the voyage was not simply an adventure. It was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in life. Families packed everything they could carry: simple clothing, wooden tools, cooking pots, seeds for future gardens. Bibles that had traveled through generations. Every item held value because space aboard the ship was extremely limited. On September 16, 1620, according to the modern calendar, the Mayflower finally left England. As the coastline slowly disappeared behind them, many passengers stood silently on deck. Some watched until the land vanished from sight. Others prayed quietly for a safe journey. Few expected the crossing to be easy. The Atlantic Ocean rarely offered smooth sailing for long. During the first weeks, strong winds pushed the ship steadily westward. But autumn storms soon arrived. Massive waves lifted the Mayflower high into the air before dropping it sharply into deep valleys of water. The wooden ship creaked loudly with every powerful wave. Rain soaked the sails. Cold winds swept across the crowded deck. Many passengers became seasick. Life below deck was cramped and uncomfortable. Families shared very little space. Fresh air was limited. Meals were simple, often consisting of dried meat, biscuits, cheese, peas, and whatever supplies remained from England. Every barrel of fresh water had to be carefully protected. Despite the hardships, each sunrise reminded the passengers that they were one day closer to their destination. As the weeks passed, the storms slowly faded. Calmer seas returned. Seabirds began appearing more frequently. Floating branches drifted across the water. These familiar signs suggested that land was drawing near. Then early in November, a lookout spotted a distant shoreline. Excitement spread quickly throughout the ship. After 66 difficult days at sea, the passengers had finally reached North America. The Mayflower first anchored near the tip of what is now Cape Cod, in present-day Massachusetts. The travelers soon realized they had arrived north of their intended destination. Winter was approaching rapidly. The days were growing colder. Snow would not be far behind. Before anyone left the ship to establish a settlement, the colony's leaders recognized the importance of cooperation. While still aboard the Mayflower, 41 adult men signed an agreement that became known as the Mayflower Compact. It was a simple document. Its purpose was to create a government based on cooperation and laws that the settlers agreed to follow together. Although modest in length, the compact became one of the earliest examples of self-government among English settlers in North America. Once ashore, exploration began immediately. Small groups searched the coastline for fresh water, fertile land, and a safe location to build homes. Eventually, they selected a site where an indigenous village called Patuxet had once stood. The village had been devastated by disease several years earlier, before the Pilgrims arrived. The settlers named their new home Plymouth. The work began without delay. Trees were cut down. Simple log houses slowly took shape. Storehouses were built to protect precious food supplies. Every nail, every wooden beam, and every roof mattered. Winter was arriving quickly. The first months proved incredibly difficult. Cold winds swept across the settlement. Food remained scarce. Disease spread through the crowded community. Many settlers became seriously ill. Some never lived to see the arrival of spring. Yet those who remained continued working together with remarkable determination. They believed that if they could survive one winter, they could build a lasting community. As another quiet evening settled over Plymouth, smoke rose gently from a handful of newly built homes. The Atlantic Ocean shimmered beneath the moonlight. The surrounding forest stood silent beneath the stars. A tiny settlement had taken root on the edge of a vast continent. Its future, like Jamestown before it, remained uncertain. But history was already beginning to remember its name. The winter of 1620 was one of the hardest the people of Plymouth would ever face. Snow covered the ground for weeks at a time. Cold winds swept in from the Atlantic Ocean, rattling the wooden walls of the small homes that had only recently been built. The settlers had arrived too late in the year to plant crops. Their food supplies were limited. Many were already weak after the long voyage across the ocean. Illness spread quickly through the tiny settlement. With little medical knowledge and few supplies, there was often very little that could be done. Some days, the sound of hammers building new homes was replaced by quiet silence. The colony grew smaller as winter continued. By the time spring finally arrived, nearly half of the Mayflower passengers had died. Yet the settlement did not disappear. Those who survived remained determined to continue. Each morning, they gathered their strength and returned to work. Cabins were repaired, fields were cleared, fishing nets were mended. Hope slowly returned with the warmer weather. As the snow melted, the forests around Plymouth became green once again. Birdsong filled the morning air. Fresh water flowed through small streams. Wildflowers appeared across open meadows. Nature quietly reminded everyone that even after the hardest winter, life could begin again. One spring morning, something extraordinary happened. A Native American man walked calmly into the settlement and greeted the English settlers, in English. His name was Samoset. The settlers were amazed. They had not expected anyone living in the region to speak their language. Samoset had learned some English from fishermen and traders who had visited the coast in earlier years. His unexpected greeting marked the beginning of an important friendship. A few days later, Samoset returned with another man named Tisquantum, better known today as Squanto. Squanto spoke English even more fluently. Years earlier, he had been taken to Europe, where he learned the language before eventually finding his way back to his homeland. By the time he returned, however, tragedy had struck. Much of his own community had been devastated by disease. Despite the hardships he had endured, Squanto chose to help the struggling settlers. He taught them practical skills that would prove essential for survival. He showed them how to plant corn in the local soil. He explained how fish could be used as fertilizer to help crops grow. He demonstrated where to catch fish and shellfish. He introduced them to edible plants that grew naturally in the region. Most importantly, he helped build communication between the settlers and the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Massasoit. Soon afterward, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag reached a peace agreement. Both sides promised not to harm one another. They agreed to help each other if attacked by outside enemies. For many years, this agreement helped maintain a period of cooperation between the two communities. As spring turned into summer, the settlers followed Squanto's advice carefully. Corn began growing in neat rows. Beans climbed upward beside the corn stalks. Pumpkins and squash spread across the ground. Fishing boats returned with fresh catches from the nearby waters. Slowly, food became more plentiful. The fear of starvation began to fade. By autumn, the colony celebrated its first successful harvest. The settlers were deeply grateful that they had survived their first year. To celebrate, they held a feast that lasted several days. Members of the Wampanoag community, including Massasoit and many of his people, joined the gathering. Together they shared food, conversation, and peaceful companionship. There was roasted fowl, venison, fish, corn, and other foods gathered from the forests and fields. Centuries later, this gathering would become closely associated with the American holiday of Thanksgiving. Modern historians note that the first harvest celebration was different from today's Thanksgiving traditions, and they also recognize that relationships between English settlers and native nations later became far more complicated and often violent. Even so, that shared meal in 1621 remains an important moment in early colonial history. As another calm evening settled over Plymouth, smoke drifted gently into the cool autumn air. Children laughed outside their homes. Farmers looked across fields that had finally produced enough food. The ocean reflected the fading light of the setting sun. For the first time since arriving in North America, the people of Plymouth could look toward the future with cautious optimism. Their little settlement had survived, and with each passing season, the story of English America continued to grow, one quiet day at a time. As the years quietly passed, more ships crossed the Atlantic. What had once been an occasional voyage slowly became a familiar journey. Each spring and summer, sails appeared on the eastern horizon. Some ships carried families hopping for a new beginning. Others transported craftsmen, farmers, merchants, ministers, and laborers eager to build new communities. The English colonies along the Atlantic coast slowly began to grow. Jamestown continued expanding in Virginia. Plymouth became more established in New England. Soon, new settlements appeared between them, each with its own story, its own challenges, and its own dreams. Life in the colonies was rarely easy. Every family worked from sunrise until sunset. The forests had to be cleared before fields could be planted. Homes required constant repairs. Fences protected crops from wandering animals. Firewood had to be gathered long before winter arrived. There was always another task waiting. Yet many settlers believed that the opportunity to own land made the hard work worthwhile. In England, land was often controlled by wealthy families. In America, at least for many English settlers, owning a farm seemed far more possible. That hope encouraged thousands more people to cross the ocean. The Atlantic remained dangerous. Storms still threatened every voyage. Ships sometimes disappeared without ever reaching their destination. But year after year, more people accepted the risk. The promise of a different future proved stronger than the fear of the unknown. As the population grew, small villages slowly transformed into busy towns. Simple dirt paths became well-traveled roads. Blacksmith shops rang with the sound of hammers striking hot iron. Water-powered mills ground grain into flour. General stores offered tools, cloth, candles, and everyday supplies. Churches stood at the center of many communities. serving not only as places of worship, but also as gathering places where neighbors discussed news and important decisions. Children also became an important part of colonial life. Most boys and girls began helping their families from a young age. They collected eggs, carried water from nearby wells, fed farm animals, helped plant crops, swept floors, prepared firewood. Formal education varied from colony to colony, but many parents believed that children should learn to read, especially so they could read the Bible. Schools slowly appeared in larger settlements, although many lessons still took place at home. The natural world remained both beautiful and demanding. In spring, rivers overflowed with fresh water from melting snow. Summer brought warm sunshine, but also powerful thunderstorms. Autumn painted the forests with brilliant colors before the first cold winds arrived. Winter covered the landscape in frost and snow, reminding everyone once again of the importance of preparation. The seasons shaped nearly every part of colonial life. Meanwhile, relationships between the English colonies and indigenous nations continued to change. In some regions, trade flourished. Furs, corn, and food were exchanged for metal tools, cloth, and other European goods. Both sides benefited from peaceful cooperation. Yet as more settlers arrived and more land was claimed for farms and towns, tensions increased in many areas. Different ideas about land ownership, resources, and political authority sometimes led to conflict. History became increasingly complex, with periods of peace followed by periods of violence. Every colony experienced these relationships differently. Despite these growing challenges, exploration continued. English settlers gradually moved farther inland. Rivers became important pathways into unfamiliar territories. Surveyors carefully measured land. Mapmakers filled previously blank spaces with new rivers, hills, forests, and villages. What had once seemed like the edge of the known world slowly became better understood. Back in Europe, maps of North America grew more detailed every decade. Places that had once existed only as rumors now appeared clearly labeled: Virginia, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Jamestown. New settlements continued appearing along the coastline. Few people living at the time realized how quickly everything was changing. Within only a few generations, a handful of tiny settlements had grown into thriving colonies connected by trade, shared language, and expanding communities. The foundations of a future nation were quietly taking shape, not through one great event, not through one famous battle, but through countless ordinary days filled with planting, harvesting, building, learning, and hopping. As another peaceful evening settled over the Atlantic coast, lanterns glowed softly inside wooden homes. Smoke curled gently from stone chimneys. The forests grew quiet beneath the fading light. And above every colony, from Virginia to New England, the same timeless stars watched over a land whose history was only beginning to unfold. By the middle of the 17th century, the English colonies had become a permanent part of life along the Atlantic coast. What had once been a few scattered settlements had grown into busy communities connected by rivers, dirt roads, and the sea. Ships arrived from England almost every season. Some brought families hopping to begin a new life. Others carried books, tools, livestock, furniture, and supplies that were difficult to produce in the colonies. On their return voyages, the ships were loaded with tobacco, timber, fish, furs, and other valuable goods bound for European markets. The Atlantic Ocean had become a busy highway of commerce. Although the journey still took many weeks, it connected two worlds more closely than ever before. In the northern colonies, many families made their living through farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The rocky soil was not always ideal for large plantations, so people often relied on many different occupations. The forests provided strong timber for building ships. Harbors became filled with fishing boats returning each day with cod, mackerel, and other catches from the cold Atlantic waters. Merchants opened small businesses along the waterfront, trading goods with neighboring colonies and with Europe. Farther south, Virginia and the surrounding colonies continued producing large quantities of tobacco. The crop remained one of the colony's greatest sources of wealth. As farms expanded, New roads connected plantations to nearby rivers where ships waited to transport the harvest overseas. Along those rivers, life followed a peaceful daily rhythm. At sunrise, boats drifted across calm water, workers headed into the fields, children helped care for gardens and farm animals. By evening, the sounds of the day slowly faded as lanterns glowed inside wooden homes. Despite the distance between the colonies, many people shared similar routines. They worked hard. They depended on the changing seasons. They gathered with family for meals. On Sundays, many attended church, where neighbors exchanged news from nearby towns and from England. Travel between colonies remained slow. A journey that today might take only a few hours could require several days by horse, wagon, or boat. Heavy rain often turned dirt roads into thick mud. Dense forests stretched between many settlements. Rivers frequently offered the fastest and safest routes for travel. Because communities were separated by long distances, each colony gradually developed its own customs and traditions. Some welcomed people from many different countries. Others remained closely connected to the religious beliefs that had inspired their founders. Even though they all belonged to England, no two colonies were exactly alike. As towns grew larger, education also became more important. Parents wanted their children to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Small schools appeared in many communities. Teachers often worked in simple one-room buildings where children of different ages studied together. Books remained expensive, so students cared for them carefully. Learning was considered an important responsibility, especially in New England, where many believed everyone should be able to read the Bible. Printing presses also became more common. Newspapers slowly began sharing news from both America and Europe. Although information still traveled much more slowly than it does today, people became increasingly aware of events happening beyond their own towns. Ideas spread from colony to colony. Merchants discussed trade. Farmers shared new techniques. Religious leaders exchanged sermons. Political debates gradually became more common. The colonies were beginning to develop their own identity. Still, life was far from perfect. Harsh winters, powerful storms, crop failures, and outbreaks of disease continued to challenge every community. Many families experienced hardship, yet they also showed remarkable resilience. Neighbors often worked together to rebuild homes after fires or storms. Communities gathered to harvest crops when one family fell ill. Helping one another became an important part of colonial life. As the decades quietly passed, children born in America grew into adults who had never seen England. To them, the forests, rivers, mountains, and coastlines of North America were simply home. They spoke English. They honored the English king. But they also began thinking of themselves as people of the colonies rather than newcomers from across the sea. Without realizing it, a new American identity was slowly beginning to emerge. It would take many more years before that identity led to calls for independence. For now, however, the colonies remained loyal to England. The future seemed peaceful. The towns continued growing. The fields continued producing food. Ships continued crossing the Atlantic. And beneath another quiet night filled with countless stars, the story of colonial America moved gently toward the next great chapter in its remarkable history. As the 17th century slowly gave way to the 18th, the English colonies continued to flourish. By the early 1700s, 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast of North America, from the rocky shores of New Hampshire in the north to the warm fields of Georgia in the south. Each colony had its own character, traditions, and way of life. Together, however, they formed a long chain of growing communities connected by rivers, coastal waters, and shared history. The northern colonies became known for their busy ports. Cities such as Boston gradually grew into important centers of trade. Every morning, merchant ships arrived carrying goods from Europe, the Caribbean, and neighboring colonies. The docks echoed with the sounds of sailors unloading barrels, ropes creaking against wooden masts, and merchants negotiating prices. Nearby, skilled craftsmen worked in small workshops. Blacksmiths forged horseshoes and tools. Coopers carefully built wooden barrels. Shipwrights shaped enormous timbers into sturdy vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic. The sea touched nearly every part of daily life. Farther south, life followed a different rhythm. Large farms stretched across the fertile countryside. Fields of tobacco in Virginia, rice in South Carolina, and indigo in parts of the South became valuable exports. These crops required enormous amounts of labor. By this time, the system of chattel slavery had become firmly established in the southern colonies. Enslaved African men, women, and children were forced to work under brutal conditions and denied basic freedoms. Despite unimaginable hardship, they preserved traditions, built families and communities where they could, and contributed profoundly to the culture, agriculture, and economy of colonial America. Their experiences became one of the most painful and important parts of American history. Meanwhile, the middle colonies, including places such as Pennsylvania and New York, became centers of remarkable diversity. People from England, Germany, the Netherlands, Scotland, Ireland, and many other parts of Europe settled there. Different languages could often be heard in the same marketplace. Churches representing various Christian traditions stood within walking distance of one another. Markets overflowed with fresh vegetables, grain, fruit, livestock, and handmade goods brought by farmers from the surrounding countryside. Life in the colonies became increasingly comfortable compared with the difficult early years of Jamestown and Plymouth. Many families lived in sturdy wooden or brick homes. Children attended school more regularly. Books became easier to obtain. Newspapers connected distant communities by sharing news from across the colonies and from Europe. Coffee houses and taverns became places where neighbors gathered to exchange ideas, discuss politics, and debate the latest events. Although communication remained slow by modern standards, people were becoming more informed than ever before. At the same time, the colonies continued expanding westward. Settlers crossed rivers and explored valleys beyond the original coastal communities. New farms appeared along the frontier. Cabins rose in places where forests had stood undisturbed for centuries. For indigenous nations already living in those regions, this expansion often brought increasing pressure and conflict over land and resources. Treaties were sometimes negotiated. Trade continued in many areas. Yet disagreements also became more frequent as colonial populations grew. Across the Atlantic, England watched its colonies with great interest. They had become valuable sources of trade and raw materials. Ships loaded with timber, tobacco, rice, furs, and other products sailed regularly toward British ports. In return, manufactured goods, books, clothing, and tools arrived in America. The relationship seemed beneficial to many people on both sides of the ocean. Few imagined that serious disagreements would one day arise between Britain and its colonies. For now, loyalty to the British crown remained strong. Most colonists still considered themselves proud British subjects. They celebrated the king's birthday. They followed English laws. Many still dreamed of one day visiting the country their parents or grandparents had left behind. Yet small changes were quietly taking place. Children born in America viewed the land differently from those who had crossed the Atlantic. They knew the forests, rivers, and mountains as their own home. Their experiences shaped a growing sense of identity that was uniquely colonial. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice from one year to the next. But history often changes that way, not with sudden thunder, but with quiet footsteps that only become clear when looking back. As another peaceful evening settled across the 13 colonies, lanterns glowed in windows from New Hampshire to Georgia. Fishing boats returned to quiet harbors. Farmers finished their day's work. Merchants closed their shops. Families gathered around warm fireplaces, sharing stories as the stars slowly appeared overhead. No one could yet see the storm that history was preparing. Across Europe, rival empires were competing for power. Their struggles would soon reach North America, and before long, the colonies would find themselves caught in a conflict that would change their future forever. The peaceful rhythm of colonial life continued for many years. Children grew into adults. Small villages became thriving towns. Busy ports welcomed ships from across the Atlantic, while farmers harvested crops that traveled to distant markets around the world. To many colonists, the future seemed bright. Yet beyond the quiet streets and fertile fields, Europe was changing once again. The world's great empires were competing for land, trade, and influence. Among the strongest rivals were Great Britain and France. Both nations claimed vast territories in North America. The British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Far to the north and west, France controlled enormous regions of Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. Although their settlements were separated by forests, rivers, and mountains, their ambitions often overlapped. At first, ordinary colonists noticed little difference. Life continued much as it always had. Merchants opened their shops at sunrise. Farmers worked their fields. Fishing boats left the harbors before dawn. Children attended school or helped their families with daily chores. But governors, military leaders, and diplomats understood that tensions were growing. As more settlers moved westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains, questions arose over who controlled the rich valleys and rivers beyond them. Both Britain and France claimed much of the same land. Neither side wished to give it up. The disagreement slowly grew into a much larger conflict. In 1754, fighting broke out in North America. The conflict became known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, while it formed part of the wider global 7 Years' War. Despite the name, the war was not fought between France and all indigenous peoples. Many native nations chose different alliances based on their own interests and long-standing relationships. Some supported the French, others sided with the British. Many tried to protect their own communities as powerful empires struggled for control of their homelands. The forests that had long echoed with birdsong now occasionally heard the distant sounds of marching soldiers. Wooden forts appeared along important rivers. Supply wagons traveled rough frontier roads. Messengers rode for days carrying important news between settlements. A young officer who gained valuable experience during the early years of the conflict was George Washington. At the time, he was not yet the famous leader Americans would later remember. He was a young Virginian officer learning difficult lessons about leadership, strategy, and the challenges of frontier warfare. Years later, those experiences would shape his role in an even greater struggle. The war lasted for several years. Battles were fought across forests, rivers, lakes, and frontier settlements. Life became difficult for many families living near the fighting. Some left their homes seeking safety. Others supplied food and equipment to soldiers. Merchants worried about disrupted trade. Farmers feared losing their harvests. Eventually, Britain achieved victory. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. France gave up most of its mainland territories in North America east of the Mississippi River, greatly expanding British control. To many colonists, the victory seemed like wonderful news. The French threat had largely disappeared. People celebrated. Church bells rang. Communities gave thanks for peace. But hidden beneath the celebration was a problem that few fully understood. The war had been extremely expensive. Britain had borrowed enormous amounts of money to pay for soldiers, ships, weapons, and supplies. The British government now faced a difficult question. How could it repay those debts? Many leaders in London believed the American colonies should help cover part of the cost, especially since the war had been fought partly to defend them. At first, this idea may have seemed reasonable to officials across the Atlantic, but many colonists viewed the situation differently. They believed they had already contributed through military service, local taxes, and years of hardship along the frontier. Neither side realized that these different perspectives would soon lead to growing disagreements. The years of quiet cooperation between Britain and its colonies were beginning to change, not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, one decision at a time, one law at a time, one disagreement after another. As another peaceful evening settled across the colonies, families gathered around their fireplaces, unaware that history was quietly turning a page. The stars above looked exactly as they always had. The rivers continued their gentle flow. The forests whispered in the evening breeze. Yet the path ahead would soon lead toward one of the most remarkable chapters in the story of the United States. The first sparks of revolution were beginning to glow. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Life across the American colonies appeared peaceful on the surface. The markets remained busy. Farmers continued planting their fields. Merchant ships sailed in and out of colonial harbors. Children walked to school. Apprentices learned new trades, and families gathered around dinner tables each evening just as they always had. Yet beneath that ordinary routine, something was beginning to change. Far across the Atlantic in London, the British government faced enormous debt after years of war. Members of Parliament searched for ways to pay the nation's expenses. Many believed that the American colonies, which had benefited from Britain's military protection, should contribute more to the cost. Over the next several years, Parliament introduced a series of new taxes and regulations affecting the colonies. One of the first was the Sugar Act of 1764, which strengthened customs enforcement and affected the trade of goods such as sugar and molasses. A year later came the Stamp Act. Unlike earlier trade duties, this law required many printed materials in the colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and playing cards, to carry an official tax stamp purchased from the British government. To officials in London, it seemed like a practical way to raise revenue. To many colonists, however, it raised an important constitutional question. They argued that they had no elected representatives in the British Parliament. If they could not vote for the lawmakers creating these taxes, should Parliament have the authority to tax them directly? A phrase soon began appearing in speeches, newspapers, and public conversations. No taxation without representation. The word spread from town to town. They did not necessarily mean that colonists rejected all taxes. Many objected specifically to being taxed by a legislature in which they had no elected voice. Throughout the colonies, meetings were held in churches, taverns, and town halls. Neighbors gathered to discuss the new laws. Printers published essays defending different points of view. Some colonists urged patience and compromise. Others believed stronger action was necessary. Despite their disagreements, one thing became increasingly clear. People were thinking more seriously about the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. Eventually, widespread protests and organized resistance persuaded Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. Many colonists celebrated the decision. Church bells rang, bonfires lit the night sky. For a brief time, it seemed the disagreement might be over. But the peace did not last. Soon afterward, Parliament introduced new import duties known as the Townshend Acts, placing taxes on goods such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Once again, protests spread across the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts, agreeing not to import certain British products. Families looked for locally made alternatives whenever possible. Women played an especially important role by producing homemade cloth and encouraging households to avoid imported goods. Their efforts demonstrated that political movements often depended not only on speeches and debates, but also on countless everyday choices made inside ordinary homes. Meanwhile, Boston became one of the centers of colonial resistance. Its narrow streets were filled with merchants, sailors, craftsmen, apprentices, and laborers. The city bustled with activity from sunrise until long after sunset. As tensions increased, Britain sent additional soldiers to Boston to help maintain order. The arrival of red-coated troops changed the atmosphere. Some residents welcomed the added security. Others viewed the soldiers as a symbol of unwanted control. Daily life continued, but the mood had become noticeably different. Arguments occasionally broke out between civilians and soldiers. Newspapers reported every disagreement. Rumors spread quickly through crowded streets and busy taverns. Trust slowly faded. The relationship between Britain and many colonists had become strained in ways that few people could have imagined only a decade earlier. Yet even during these difficult years, most colonists were not calling for independence. Many still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They hoped the disputes could be resolved through discussion, fairness, and mutual understanding. No one knew exactly where the growing tensions would lead. As another quiet evening settled over Boston Harbor, merchant ships rocked gently with the tide. Lanterns glowed in the windows of brick buildings. The cool sea breeze drifted through the streets. Everything looked peaceful beneath the stars, but history was moving quietly beneath the surface. Soon, one tragic night in Boston would shock the colonies, deepen divisions, and bring the path toward revolution one step closer. The evening of March 5, 1770, began much like many others in Boston. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the harbor. A cool breeze drifted through the narrow streets. Merchants closed their shops for the night. Lanterns flickered to life in windows, casting a warm glow onto the cobblestone roads. Sailors returned from the docks. Families gathered inside their homes for supper. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but beneath the calm surface, the city had been living with growing tension for months. British soldiers stood guard in several parts of Boston. Many colonists disliked their presence, believing the troops represented unfair government control. The soldiers, on the other hand, often felt unwelcome and surrounded by hostility. Small arguments had become common. Harsh words were exchanged. Patience was wearing thin on both sides. That evening, a disagreement near the customs house slowly drew a crowd. People gathered out of curiosity. Some shouted insults. Others watched in silence. More soldiers arrived to support the guard already on duty. The situation became increasingly tense. No one can say with complete certainty what happened in every single moment that followed. Witnesses later gave different accounts. Some remembered hearing angry voices. Others recalled snowballs, pieces of ice, or small objects being thrown. Then, amid the confusion, gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, several colonists had been struck. 5 men eventually died from their wounds, including Crispus Attucks, a sailor and dockworker of African and Native American ancestry, who is often remembered as the first person killed in the incident. The event quickly became known as the Boston Massacre. News spread with remarkable speed. Printers produced newspaper articles describing what had happened. One of the most influential images was an engraving created by Paul Revere. Although historians today note that the engraving simplified and dramatized the scene, it powerfully shaped public opinion throughout the colonies. For many colonists, the Boston Massacre became a symbol of growing conflict with British authority. Yet an important part of the story is sometimes overlooked. When the British soldiers were put on trial, they were defended by John Adams, a respected lawyer who believed that everyone deserved a fair trial, even in moments of great public anger. After hearing the evidence, the jury found most of the soldiers not guilty. 2 were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The trial demonstrated that, despite the intense emotions of the time, many colonists remained committed to the principle of justice and the rule of law. Even so, the relationship between Britain and the colonies continued to deteriorate. Although Parliament repealed most of the townshend duties, the tax on tea remained in place. The amount was relatively small. The principle behind it, however, remained deeply important to many colonists. They continued asking the same question that had echoed through town meetings for years: who had the right to tax the colonies? In coffeehouses, taverns, churches, and marketplaces, neighbors quietly debated the future. Some hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Others believed stronger resistance had become necessary. Most ordinary families simply wanted peace. They wished to raise their children, tend their farms, run their businesses, and live without conflict. Yet history was slowly carrying them toward decisions that would shape generations to come. As the seasons changed once again, ships continued arriving in Boston Harbor. Among their cargo was tea, ordinary tea that had become the center of an extraordinary political debate. Before long, one December night would transform those crates of tea into one of the most famous acts of protest in American history. The calm waters of Boston Harbor were about to witness an event that people would remember for centuries. The winter air over Boston Harbor was cold and still. It was the evening of December 16, 1773. A thin layer of ice floated along the edges of the docks, while the dark water reflected the light of a nearly full moon. 3 British merchant ships rested quietly in the harbor. Their names were the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Inside their cargo holds were hundreds of wooden chests filled with tea. To most people, tea was simply an everyday drink. Families in Britain enjoyed it each afternoon. Many colonists in America did as well. But by the winter of 1773, tea had become much more than a beverage. It had become a symbol. Earlier that year, the British Parliament had passed the Tea Act. Contrary to what many people assume today, the law actually lowered the price of tea sold by the British East India Company. However, it also reinforced Parliament's authority to tax tea in the colonies. Many colonists believed that accepting the tea, even at a lower price, would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. For weeks, meetings were held throughout Boston. Citizens gathered in churches, taverns, and public halls. They debated what should be done. Some urged compromise. Others insisted that the tea should never be unloaded. Hour after hour, the discussions continued. Outside, the three ships remained anchored in the harbor, waiting. The law required that the tea either be unloaded and the tax paid or the ships returned to England. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to leave without following British law. As the deadline approached, the tension grew. Then, on the evening of December 16, thousands of people gathered at the Old South Meeting House. The meeting lasted for hours. Finally, it became clear that no peaceful agreement had been reached. As darkness settled over Boston, a group of colonists quietly left the meeting. To conceal their identities, many disguised themselves with clothing inspired by Native American attire, though not as an authentic representation of any specific indigenous nation. Their purpose was practical. They wanted to avoid being recognized. Moving quickly through the cold night, they headed toward Griffin's Wharf, where the three tea ships waited. Without harming the crews or stealing other cargo, the protesters climbed aboard. Working with surprising discipline, they opened the wooden chests one by one. Then they emptied the tea into the icy waters below. Chest after chest crashed open. Dark tea leaves drifted across the harbor. By the time the work was finished, 342 chests of tea had been dumped into Boston Harbor. The entire action lasted only a few hours. When it was over, the protesters quietly left the ships. Remarkably, very little else was damaged. Locks that had been broken were even replaced before the group departed. Their goal had been to destroy the tea, not to loot the ships or injure anyone. The following morning, Boston Harbor looked very different. Tea floated across the surface of the water. The smell of wet tea leaves lingered along the docks. News of the event spread rapidly. Some colonists praised the protest as a courageous stand for colonial rights. Others worried that destroying private property would provoke a harsh response from Britain. Across the Atlantic, the British government reacted with anger. Parliament believed that Boston had openly challenged its authority. In response, lawmakers passed a series of measures in 1774 that became known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and were called the Intolerable Acts by many colonists. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts lost much of its self-government. British control over the colony became much stricter. Instead of weakening colonial resistance, these new laws had the opposite effect. Many colonists who had remained neutral now began sympathizing with Massachusetts. Communities from Georgia to New Hampshire collected food, supplies, and money to support the people of Boston during the port's closure. For the first time, the 13 colonies began acting together in a way they never had before. What had started as disagreements over taxes was becoming something much larger. A growing sense of unity was spreading across the colonies. No one yet knew whether peace could still be preserved. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies had entered a new and uncertain chapter. And before long, representatives from across the colonies would gather for an extraordinary meeting, one that would help shape the future of America forever. The closing of Boston Harbor sent shockwaves through the American colonies. What had begun as a dispute in one city was no longer Boston's problem alone. From the rocky coast of New Hampshire to the warm fields of Georgia, people followed the news with growing concern. Newspapers carried detailed reports. Traveling writers delivered letters between towns. Merchants discussed the latest developments at busy docks. Farmers paused their work to listen as neighbors read news aloud in village squares. Many colonists believed that if Parliament could close the port of Boston, it might one day impose similar punishments on any colony. A sense of shared purpose slowly began to emerge. Leaders from different colonies exchanged letters, urging cooperation rather than acting alone. Although each colony had its own government, traditions, and economy, many people now realized that their futures were closely connected. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies traveled to the city of Philadelphia. Only Georgia, facing its own frontier challenges, did not send representatives at that time. The gathering became known as the First Continental Congress. For many of the delegates, it was the first time they had met face to face. They came from different backgrounds. Some were lawyers, some were merchants, others were farmers or experienced public officials. Among them were men who would later become well known in American history, including George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Jay. Despite their different personalities and opinions, they all recognized that the colonies faced an important moment. Inside Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, long discussions filled the days. The delegates debated carefully and respectfully. Some still hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain. They believed that misunderstandings could be resolved if the king and parliament listened to the concerns of the colonies. Others feared that stronger action might eventually become unavoidable. Yet almost everyone agreed that the colonies should work together rather than face the crisis separately. After weeks of discussion, the delegates reached several important decisions. They agreed to organize a widespread boycott of British goods until the intolerable acts were repealed. They also prepared a respectful petition to King George III, explaining the colony's grievances and asking for a peaceful solution. The Congress did not declare independence. In fact, many delegates still considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown. Their goal was reform, not revolution. As autumn settled across the colonies, ordinary life continued. Children attended school, farmers harvested corn, wheat, and apples. Fishing boats returned to their harbors before sunset. Church bells rang each Sunday morning, yet conversations had changed. At dinner tables, families discussed politics alongside the weather and the harvest. In taverns, neighbors debated speeches made in Philadelphia. Printers worked late into the night producing newspapers, pamphlets, and letters that carried new ideas from colony to colony. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, British leaders remained determined to maintain parliamentary authority over the colonies. Neither side fully understood how difficult compromise had become. Each believed it was defending important principles. With every passing month, trust continued to weaken. During the winter of 1774 and the early months of 1775, both sides quietly prepared for the possibility that events might take an even more serious turn. Colonial militias increased their training. Local communities gathered supplies, including food, blankets, and equipment. British military commanders also strengthened their preparations around Boston. Still, many people hoped that conflict could somehow be avoided. They wished for one final chance to restore peace. But history often reaches moments when ordinary conversations can no longer prevent extraordinary events. The calm countryside of Massachusetts was about to become the stage for a turning point. Before sunrise on an April morning in 1775, a column of British soldiers would begin marching toward the small towns of Lexington and Concord. The quiet roads they followed had witnessed generations of peaceful travelers. Soon, they would witness the first shots of a war that would forever change the history of the United States. And although no one present could know it at the time, those first echoes of gunfire would one day be remembered as the shot heard round the world. The evening of April 18, 1775, settled gently over the countryside of Massachusetts. A cool spring breeze drifted through budding trees. The last light of day faded behind rolling hills as farmers finished their work and families gathered inside their homes. It appeared to be an ordinary evening, but in Boston, British military leaders were preparing for a secret mission. General Thomas Gage, the commander of British forces in Massachusetts, ordered about 700 soldiers to march to the town of Concord. Their objective was to seize military supplies that colonial militias were believed to have stored there. British officials also hoped to arrest colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying nearby in Lexington. The mission depended on speed and surprise. If the soldiers could leave Boston unnoticed, they might complete their assignment before the colonial militias had time to react. But word of the plan quietly reached Patriot leaders. Messengers hurried through the streets of Boston. Among those who helped organize the warning was Dr. Joseph Warren. He understood that every hour mattered. Late that evening, two trusted riders prepared to leave the city. One was Paul Revere, a skilled silversmith and well-known patriot. The other was William Dawes, who took a different route so that at least one rider might succeed if the other were stopped. Before crossing the Charles River, lanterns were briefly displayed from the steeple of the Old North Church. The famous signal, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, was intended to tell observers which route the British troops had taken as they crossed the water. 2 lanterns were shown that night because the soldiers crossed Boston Harbor before beginning their march. Revere rode swiftly through the dark countryside. Rather than shouting a single dramatic phrase, as later legends sometimes suggested, he quietly warned local leaders that British regulars were on the move. At nearly every village, church bells rang, dogs barked, windows opened. Militia captains were awakened from their sleep. Farmers left their beds to gather muskets and powder. The warning spread from one town to the next with remarkable speed. By midnight, the countryside was alive with riders carrying the same urgent message. Some traveled on horseback, others continued on foot. Every mile gained gave the colonial militias more time to prepare. Shortly after midnight, Paul Revere reached Lexington, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. The 2 leaders were warned and soon left the area for safety. Later that night, Revere continued toward Concord with other riders. Along the way, however, a British patrol stopped them. Revere was captured and questioned before eventually being released, though his horse was taken. Even so, his mission had already succeeded. The alarm had spread. Throughout the Massachusetts countryside, members of local militias quietly gathered. These citizen soldiers were often called Minutemen because they pledged to be ready to respond at a minute's notice. Most were ordinary people: farmers, blacksmiths, millers, shopkeepers, carpenters. During the day, they worked in their communities. Only when danger threatened did they take up their weapons. As dawn approached on April 19, the British column marched steadily along the road toward Lexington. Mist hovered over open fields. Birds greeted the first light of morning. The village itself remained peaceful. Yet on the Lexington Green, a small company of Minutemen had already assembled. They did not intend to launch an attack. Their captain, John Parker, reportedly instructed them to stand their ground but not fire unless fired upon. Across the quiet village green, the British soldiers approached in disciplined formation. Both sides were tense. Neither side fully knew what the other intended. Then, in the confusion of that early morning, a single gunshot rang out. To this day, historians do not know who fired it. That mysterious shot was followed by a brief exchange of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonial militiamen lay dead, and others were wounded. The British troops continued toward Concord, but the events at Lexington had changed everything. The long political dispute between Britain and its American colonies had become an armed conflict. The quiet roads of Massachusetts had witnessed the opening moments of the American Revolutionary War, and farther ahead, at Concord's North Bridge, another encounter was about to transform history even further. As the British soldiers continued their march toward Concord, the early morning sun slowly rose above the Massachusetts countryside. A light mist drifted across open fields. Birdsong echoed through the trees. From a distance, the peaceful landscape gave little hint that history was unfolding along its quiet roads. The British column entered Concord a few hours after the brief clash at Lexington. Their orders were to search for military supplies believed to be hidden by the colonial militias. The soldiers inspected barns, workshops, and storehouses. They found and destroyed some cannon carriages, ammunition, and other equipment. However, thanks to the warnings carried through the countryside during the night, many important supplies had already been moved to safer locations. While the search continued, hundreds of colonial militia members gathered on the hills overlooking the town. More arrived with every passing hour. They watched carefully from a distance, waiting for news. No one wanted unnecessary bloodshed, yet everyone understood that the situation had become far more serious than it had been only a day earlier. Near the edge of Concord stood the North Bridge, a simple wooden bridge crossing the Concord River. British soldiers moved to guard the crossing. On the opposite side, colonial militia companies gradually assembled. Among them were farmers carrying muskets they normally used for hunting. Blacksmiths stood beside schoolteachers. Young men stood shoulder to shoulder with older veterans who still remembered earlier frontier wars. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton led one of the militia companies. Before marching toward the bridge, he reportedly said he had not been afraid to go. His men quietly prepared themselves. Around mid-morning, the colonial force advanced toward the bridge in orderly formation. The British soldiers, seeing the militia approach, became increasingly alert. Neither side wished to be the first to fire. For a few tense moments, both groups stood facing one another across the bridge. Then, amid confusion that historians still study today, shots were fired. This time, the colonial militia returned fire. When the brief battle ended, several British soldiers had been killed or wounded. Captain Isaac Davis also lost his life while leading the advance. The British troops withdrew from the bridge. For the first time during the conflict, colonial militia had successfully forced British regulars to retreat from a battlefield. The moment carried enormous symbolic importance. News spread quickly throughout New England. People realized that the fighting at Lexington had not been an isolated incident. A war had truly begun. By early afternoon, the British commander ordered his soldiers to return to Boston. The march back proved far more difficult than the journey out. As the long column moved along the narrow country roads, colonial militia gathered behind stone walls, trees, fences, and hillsides. Rather than fighting in one large formation, they used the landscape to their advantage. Whenever opportunities appeared, they fired from cover before moving to new positions. The British troops continued marching under constant pressure. It became an exhausting day. Smoke drifted through the forests. Gunfire echoed across quiet valleys. The spring air carried the sounds for miles. Fresh militia companies joined the pursuit from neighboring towns, while others hurried ahead to block roads and strengthen defensive positions. By the time British reinforcements reached the retreating column near Lexington, many soldiers were exhausted from hours of marching and fighting. Together, the combined force slowly made its way back toward Boston. As evening approached, the British finally reached the safety of the city. The cost of the day's fighting was significant. Hundreds of soldiers on both sides had been killed, wounded, or reported missing. Families throughout Massachusetts soon learned that fathers, brothers, sons, and neighbors would not be returning home. The quiet countryside had been changed forever. Within days, thousands of militia members from across New England surrounded Boston. They established camps on the hills outside the city, beginning what became the Siege of Boston. The British Army remained inside the town. The colonial forces waited beyond it. Neither side realized how long the struggle would last. The events at Lexington and Concord had transformed years of political disagreement into open war. The 13 colonies now faced a future filled with uncertainty. Some still hoped for reconciliation. Others believed independence had become inevitable. For the moment, however, no declaration had yet been written. No new nation had yet been born. Only the long, quiet determination of ordinary people preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. And beneath another peaceful night sky, the campfires surrounding Boston flickered gently in the darkness, as the first chapter of the American Revolution came to a close. In the weeks following the battles of Lexington and Concord, the quiet countryside around Boston changed dramatically. Fields that had recently been planted with spring crops now overlooked long lines of military camps. Smoke from hundreds of campfires drifted gently into the morning sky. Roads that had once carried farmers and merchants were now filled with wagons transporting food, blankets, tools, and supplies. Militia companies continued arriving from towns across New England. Many of the volunteers had never served as full-time soldiers. They were ordinary citizens. Farmers left their fields. Blacksmiths closed their workshops. Teachers locked their schoolhouses. Merchants handed their businesses to family members. They believed their communities needed them. By early summer, nearly 20,000 colonial soldiers surrounded Boston. Although they came from different colonies, spoke with different accents, and followed different local traditions, they shared a common purpose. They hoped to defend what they believed were their rights. Inside Boston, British troops remained firmly in control of the city. The harbor allowed ships to bring supplies from across the Atlantic. But on land, the city was surrounded. The standoff became known as the Siege of Boston. For weeks, very little major fighting occurred. Instead, both sides watched each other carefully. They strengthened their positions, they gathered supplies, they waited. Meanwhile, delegates from the colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress opened its meetings. Unlike the first gathering the previous year, the situation had changed completely. Shots had already been fired. Lives had already been lost. The delegates now faced an enormous responsibility. Should the colonies continue seeking peace with Britain, or should they prepare for a long war? The discussions lasted for many days. Opinions differed. Some delegates still hoped that King George III might help restore peace. Others believed the conflict had gone too far to be settled easily. Even so, everyone recognized that the colonies needed stronger coordination if they were to defend themselves. One of the Congress's most important decisions was to create the Continental Army. Until then, most military forces had been local militias organized by individual colonies. Now, they would become part of a united army serving all the colonies together. The delegates also needed someone capable of leading this new force. Their choice fell upon George Washington of Virginia. Washington was already respected throughout the colonies. He had served during the French and Indian War and was known for his discipline, calm judgment, and sense of responsibility. Although he had not sought the position, he accepted it with humility. He understood that the task before him would be extraordinarily difficult. In June 1775, Washington left Philadelphia and began the long journey toward Massachusetts. As he traveled north, townspeople often gathered along the roads to greet him. Many placed great hope in their new commander. When Washington finally arrived outside Boston, he found an army full of determination but facing many challenges. The soldiers came from different colonies. They wore different uniforms, or sometimes no uniforms at all. Many brought their own muskets. Supplies were limited. Gunpowder was scarce. Training varied widely. Some men had military experience, others had never stood in formation before. Washington immediately began organizing the army. He established clearer rules, improved discipline, strengthened supply systems. He believed that courage alone would not be enough. The army also needed order, patience, and careful leadership. Each day, soldiers drilled on open fields, officers practiced giving commands. Blacksmiths repaired broken equipment, carpenters built wagons and barracks. Women also played important roles around the camps by cooking meals, washing clothing, mending uniforms, and caring for the sick and wounded. The growing army became a community as much as a military force. As summer settled over Massachusetts, both armies remained only a few miles apart. Neither side knew exactly when the next major battle would begin. Yet everyone sensed that another confrontation was approaching. Just outside Boston stood a series of hills overlooking the harbor. Among them were Breed's Hill and nearby Bunker Hill. Whoever controlled those heights could influence the movement of ships and troops around the city. Before long, those quiet hills would become the setting for one of the fiercest battles of the entire Revolutionary War. And the courage shown there would echo through American history for generations to come. On the warm evening of June 16, 1775, hundreds of colonial soldiers quietly gathered outside Boston. The sun had already slipped below the horizon. Darkness settled across the hills overlooking the harbor. The only sounds were soft footsteps, whispered conversations, and the distant waves brushing against the shoreline. The men had received an important assignment. They were to strengthen the high ground overlooking Boston before the British Army realized what was happening. Originally, the plan called for fortifying Bunker Hill, but for reasons historians still discuss, the colonial officers instead focused much of their effort on the smaller, lower Breed's Hill, which stood closer to Boston. Working through the night, the soldiers dug trenches and piled earth into defensive walls. Some used shovels, others worked with pickaxes. Many simply carried heavy baskets filled with soil. The labor was exhausting, yet no one complained. They knew that every minute mattered. By sunrise, a strong earthen fortification stood where only open pasture had existed the evening before. When British officers looked toward the hills that morning, they were astonished. The colonial forces had built an impressive defensive position almost overnight. General Thomas Gage quickly recognized the danger. If the colonists remained on the hill, they could threaten British control of Boston Harbor. The decision was made. The position had to be captured. Later that afternoon, long rows of British soldiers crossed the harbor by boat. Their bright red uniforms stood out against the green hillside. Military bands played as the troops formed into disciplined ranks. From a distance, the scene appeared calm and orderly. Yet everyone understood that a fierce battle was about to begin. Inside the colonial defenses, the soldiers waited quietly. Many had never fought in a major battle before. Their commander on the hill, Colonel William Prescott, moved calmly among the men, encouraging them to remain steady. A famous phrase is often associated with the battle: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Although historians continue to debate whether Prescott spoke those exact words, the advice reflects an important reality. Gunpowder was limited, every shot needed to count. As the British soldiers advanced uphill in neat formations, the colonial troops held their fire. The distance between the two armies grew smaller, closer still. Then suddenly, a tremendous volley of musket fire erupted from the colonial lines. Smoke rolled across the hillside. The British front ranks staggered under the unexpected attack. Many soldiers fell. The survivors regrouped and withdrew. After reorganizing, the British launched a second assault. Once again, they climbed the steep hillside under intense fire. Again, the colonial defenders held their position. Again, the British were forced back with heavy losses. The hillside was covered with thick smoke. The summer air echoed with musket fire, shouted commands, and the thunder of artillery. But the colonial soldiers now faced a serious problem. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. When the British organized a third assault, many defenders had only a handful of cartridges remaining. Some had none at all. This time, the British reached the earthworks. Fighting continued at close range using muskets, bayonets, and whatever tools the defenders could find. Unable to continue without ammunition, the colonial forces slowly retreated from the hill in an orderly withdrawal. The British had captured the position. Technically, they had won the battle, but the victory came at an enormous cost. More than 1,000 British soldiers had been killed or wounded, far greater losses than they had expected. The colonial forces also suffered significant casualties, including the death of Dr. Joseph Warren, a respected Patriot leader who had chosen to fight as a volunteer that day. The Battle of Bunker Hill sent a powerful message across both sides of the Atlantic. The colonial army had shown that it could stand against one of the most experienced military forces in the world. Although they had given up the hill, they had fought with remarkable determination and discipline. British commanders realized that defeating the rebellion would not be quick or easy. The colonists gained something equally valuable: confidence. They now believed that with strong leadership, careful planning, and perseverance, they could continue resisting the British army. As night finally settled over the battlefield, silence slowly returned to the hills above Boston. The smoke drifted away. The campfires burned quietly once more. The stars appeared overhead, shining upon a battlefield that had forever changed the course of the American Revolution. And in the days ahead, a commander named George Washington would begin transforming a determined group of volunteers into an army capable of fighting for a nation's future. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army in July 1775, he did not find the powerful military force that many people imagine. Instead, he found thousands of determined volunteers spread across fields surrounding Boston. Their courage was undeniable. Their commitment was real. But the army faced enormous challenges. Some soldiers wore hunting clothes. Others still wore the clothing they had brought from home. Uniforms were rare. Weapons varied from one company to another. Some men carried muskets. Others brought old hunting rifles or family firearms. Even simple supplies such as blankets, boots, tents, and cooking equipment were often in short supply. Washington understood that winning a war required more than bravery. It required discipline, organization, patience, and steady leadership. Each morning, bugles and drums signaled the beginning of another busy day. Soldiers practiced marching across open fields. Officers learned how to organize their companies more effectively. Engineers strengthened defensive positions around Boston. Blacksmiths repaired broken tools and weapons. Carpenters built wagons, bridges, and storage buildings. Every person contributed in some way. Washington also insisted on higher standards of cleanliness. Although medicine in the 18th century was limited, he recognized that crowded camps could quickly become dangerous if disease spread. Soldiers were encouraged to keep their camps orderly, dispose of waste properly, and maintain cleaner living conditions whenever possible. These efforts helped improve the Army's overall health. Life in camp followed a steady rhythm. At sunrise, smoke rose from hundreds of cooking fires. Simple breakfasts often included bread, cornmeal, salted meat, or porridge. After morning drills came hours of work repairing roads, digging trenches, transporting supplies, or standing guard. Evenings were quieter. Some soldiers wrote letters home. Others mended torn clothing or shared stories around the campfire. Many wondered how long the war might last. Some believed it would end within months. Few imagined it would continue for years. One of Washington's greatest concerns was gunpowder. The Continental Army simply did not have enough ammunition. Every musket cartridge had to be used carefully. Without sufficient powder, even the bravest army could not defend itself. Messages were sent throughout the colonies requesting additional supplies. Merchants searched for sources of ammunition. Leaders worked tirelessly to gather everything the army needed. Meanwhile, inside Boston, the British Army watched the growing colonial forces with equal caution. Neither side launched a major attack. Instead, both armies strengthened their positions while waiting for opportunities. The siege continued month after month. As autumn turned into winter, cold winds swept across the camps. Snow covered the hills. Frozen ground made digging nearly impossible. Yet the soldiers remained at their posts. The hardships tested everyone. Still, the Continental Army continued improving under Washington's leadership. Far to the north, another important mission was quietly unfolding. Patriot leaders believed that British forces in the province of Quebec might one day threaten the colonies from Canada. To prevent that possibility, 2 American expeditions were organized. One traveled north through the familiar route along Lake Champlain. The other, led by Colonel Benedict Arnold, attempted an extraordinary journey through the rugged wilderness of present-day Maine. Arnold's expedition faced incredible hardships. Dense forests slowed every step. Heavy rains flooded rivers. Food supplies ran dangerously low. Many soldiers became exhausted from carrying boats and equipment across difficult terrain. Despite these obstacles, they continued pushing north with remarkable determination. Although the campaign ultimately failed to capture Quebec, it demonstrated the extraordinary endurance of the Continental soldiers. Back around Boston, another remarkable achievement was taking shape. During the winter, Colonel Henry Knox undertook a bold mission to transport dozens of heavy cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in New York to the hills overlooking Boston. The journey covered nearly 300 miles through snow, frozen rivers, forests, and mountains. Using sleds pulled by oxen, Knox and his team slowly moved the massive artillery across the winter landscape. Many believed the task was impossible. Yet week after week, the cannons continued moving closer to Boston. By the end of the winter, they finally arrived. Washington now possessed the heavy artillery he had desperately needed. The long months of preparation were about to produce results. The quiet siege that had lasted nearly a year was nearing its conclusion. Before long, the guns placed on Dorchester Heights would force Britain to make a decision that no one had expected only months earlier. Boston, the city where the Revolution had truly begun, was about to become the first great American victory of the war. The winter of 1775-1776 slowly gave way to spring. Snow melted across the hills surrounding Boston. The frozen rivers began flowing once again. For months, both the Continental Army and the British forces had watched one another from a distance, waiting for the next important move. General George Washington knew that the arrival of Colonel Henry Knox's heavy cannons had changed everything. Now he finally possessed the artillery needed to challenge British control of the city. But the cannons alone would not win the battle. They first had to be placed where they could overlook both Boston and its busy harbor. The ideal location was Dorchester Heights, a series of hills rising above the city. From those heights, cannon fire could threaten British ships anchored below. The challenge was enormous. If the British discovered Washington's plan too early, they would almost certainly attack before the defenses were complete. Everything depended on speed, secrecy, and careful planning. On the evening of March 4, 1776, as darkness settled over Massachusetts, hundreds of Continental soldiers quietly began moving toward Dorchester Heights. The roads had been softened with bundles of hay so that wagons would make less noise. The men worked mostly in silence. Oxen slowly pulled the heavy cannons uphill. Other soldiers carried shovels, axes, and wooden beams. Throughout the night, they dug trenches, built earthworks, and constructed defensive walls. The work was exhausting, yet no one stopped. Every hour brought them closer to sunrise. By the first light of morning, an astonishing sight greeted the British commanders in Boston. Where only empty hills had stood the day before, powerful American fortifications now overlooked the city. Heavy cannons pointed toward the harbor. Strong defensive positions protected the soldiers. General William Howe, who had recently replaced Thomas Gage as commander of British forces, immediately understood the danger. If Washington opened fire, British ships anchored in Boston Harbor would become extremely vulnerable. Howe considered launching a direct assault against the heights, much like the attack at Bunker Hill months earlier. Preparations even began for such an operation. But nature intervened. A powerful storm swept across the region, bringing fierce winds and rough seas. The weather made a large-scale attack nearly impossible. When the storm finally passed, Howe reconsidered. The American defenses had grown even stronger. Attacking the heights now promised enormous casualties with no guarantee of success. Instead, the British made a different decision. They would leave Boston. On March 17, 1776, British soldiers, loyalist families, and government officials boarded hundreds of ships waiting in the harbor. The evacuation took place in an orderly manner. The fleet slowly sailed away, heading first toward Halifax in present-day Canada. For the first time since the war had begun, the Continental Army had forced the British to abandon a major American city. The people of Boston watched from streets, rooftops, and nearby hills as the ships gradually disappeared beyond the horizon. Soon afterward, George Washington entered the city. There were no great celebrations filled with fireworks or grand parades. Instead, there was a quiet sense of relief. Boston had endured years of tension, occupation, and uncertainty. Now, the city was once again under Patriot control. The victory was significant not because it ended the war. It did not. But because it proved that careful planning, patience, and determination could succeed against one of the world's strongest armies. News of the evacuation spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Church bells rang. Newspapers printed exciting reports. Communities celebrated the achievement. For many people, confidence in the Continental Army grew stronger than ever before. Yet Washington understood something that others did not. The British Empire possessed a powerful navy and thousands of experienced soldiers. Losing Boston would not end Britain's campaign. It would simply shift the fighting elsewhere. Indeed, Washington correctly predicted that the British would soon target one of the most important cities in the colonies, New York. Its deep harbor, central location, and growing population made it a strategic prize. If Britain captured New York, it could divide the colonies and control vital waterways. Without delay, Washington ordered his army to prepare for another long march. Cannons were packed once again. Supply wagons rolled south. Soldiers left the hills around Boston behind. Ahead of them lay New York, where some of the greatest victories, hardest defeats, and most difficult decisions of the American Revolution were still waiting to unfold. As another peaceful evening settled over the newly liberated city of Boston, the church bells fell silent. The harbor grew calm. The campfires flickered gently beneath the spring sky. The war was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The summer of 1776 arrived with uncertainty across the American colonies. The victory at Boston had given the Continental Army new confidence, but everyone understood that Britain would return with greater strength. The British Empire had one of the most powerful militaries in the world. Its navy controlled the seas. Its army had decades of experience fighting major wars. George Washington knew that the next confrontation would test everything the young American forces had learned. His attention turned toward New York. The city was one of the most important locations in North America. Its deep harbor could support a large fleet. Its rivers provided access to the interior. Whoever controlled New York would have a major advantage. During the spring and early summer, Washington moved thousands of soldiers into the area. They built fortifications on Manhattan Island, Long Island, and nearby locations. The work was exhausting. Soldiers dug trenches under the hot summer sun. Carpenters built defensive barriers. Engineers studied maps and searched for the strongest positions. Everyone knew that a British attack was coming. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the British government had prepared an enormous military expedition. Thousands of soldiers sailed toward America under the command of General William Howe. The fleet was one of the largest Britain had ever sent. As the ships entered New York Harbor, their sails filled the horizon. To many observers, it was an overwhelming sight. Hundreds of vessels moved across the water. Thousands of troops prepared to come ashore. The British force included not only British soldiers, but also German troops known as Hessians, who had been hired to fight alongside them. The arrival of this powerful army created fear among many colonists. Some wondered whether the Continental Army could survive against such a force. Others remained determined to continue the fight. In August 1776, the British launched their attack on Long Island. The resulting Battle of Long Island became the largest battle of the Revolutionary War up to that point. Washington's army fought bravely, but the British had several advantages. They possessed more soldiers. Their officers had extensive battlefield experience. Their movements were carefully planned. The fighting spread across fields, roads, and wooded areas. American troops resisted fiercely, but eventually they were forced to retreat. Situation became dangerous. Thousands of Continental soldiers were trapped on Brooklyn. The East River separated them from Manhattan. A British victory seemed almost certain, but Washington made a remarkable decision. Rather than allowing his army to be destroyed, he organized a secret nighttime evacuation. Under cover of darkness and early morning fog, American soldiers quietly crossed the river. Small boats moved back and forth throughout the night. By morning, thousands of troops had escaped to Manhattan. The British woke to discover that the American army had vanished. The retreat was not a victory, but it was a remarkable achievement. Washington had saved his army from complete destruction. Still, the months ahead would be extremely difficult. The British continued pushing the Americans southward through New York. The Continental Army suffered several defeats. Morale declined. Many soldiers questioned whether the struggle could continue. Some enlistments were ending. Supplies were becoming scarce. Winter approached. Yet Washington refused to surrender. He understood that survival itself could become a form of victory. If the Continental Army remained alive, the hope for independence remained alive as well. During this difficult period, an important message reached the American people. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress had approved the Declaration of Independence. The document announced that the 13 colonies considered themselves free and independent states. It was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, with contributions and revisions from other members of Congress. The Declaration explained the reasons the colonies believed they had the right to separate from Great Britain. It spoke of natural rights and the idea that governments received their authority from the people. For many Americans, it represented a bold new vision. For Britain, it was an act of rebellion. The decision changed the nature of the conflict forever. The war was no longer simply a disagreement over taxes or political rights. It had become a fight for independence. As 1776 moved toward its final months, the future looked uncertain. The British Army occupied important areas. The Continental Army faced shortages and defeats. Many people wondered whether the dream of independence could survive. But history is often shaped during its darkest moments. As winter approached, George Washington prepared one final move before the year ended. His army was tired. His supplies were limited. But he believed that a bold action was necessary to restore hope. Across the icy Delaware River, a new opportunity was waiting. And on a cold December night, the Continental Army would attempt a crossing that would become one of the most famous moments of the American Revolution. The winter of 1776 was one of the darkest moments of the American Revolution. The excitement that had followed the Declaration of Independence had faded beneath the weight of hardship. The Continental Army had suffered several defeats. New York City was under British control. Many soldiers had left because their enlistments had ended. Others remained only because of their personal commitment to the cause. The army that surrounded George Washington was tired, cold, and uncertain. As December arrived, snow covered the roads and fields of Pennsylvania. The soldiers marched with worn-out clothing. Some lacked proper coats. Some had damaged shoes or no shoes at all. The shortage of food and supplies made every day difficult. Yet they continued moving forward. Washington understood that the survival of the American cause depended on something more than military strength. It depended on hope. If the army lost confidence, the entire revolution could collapse. Meanwhile, thousands of British and Hessian troops settled into winter quarters. One important group of Hessian soldiers was stationed in the small town of Trenton, New Jersey. They had fought hard during the campaign and believed they were secure. Like many armies of the 18th century, they expected winter to be a quieter season with fewer major operations. Washington saw an opportunity. He planned a surprise attack. The target was the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The plan was extremely dangerous. The Continental Army would need to cross the icy Delaware River in the middle of winter. The weather was terrible. A powerful storm arrived on Christmas night, bringing snow, freezing rain, and strong winds. Many soldiers struggled to keep their weapons dry. The boats moved slowly through chunks of ice floating in the dark water. Some men became exhausted before they even reached the opposite shore. But Washington continued encouraging his troops. The mission could not be abandoned. After hours of difficult travel, the American forces finally reached the New Jersey side of the river. By early morning on December 26, 1776, they began marching toward Trenton. The Hessian soldiers inside the town were caught completely by surprise. The attack began quickly. Gunfire echoed through the streets. The Hessians attempted to organize a defense, but the sudden assault created confusion. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was mortally wounded during the fighting. Within a short time, the American forces had achieved a remarkable victory. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. The Continental Army suffered very few losses compared with the importance of the victory. For Washington's army, the victory at Trenton was more than a military success. It was a message. The American forces were still alive. They could still fight. They could still win. News of the victory spread throughout the colonies. People who had begun to lose hope felt encouraged again. Recruitment improved. Soldiers became more willing to continue serving. The victory helped convince many Americans that independence might truly be possible. But Washington knew the struggle was not finished. The British remained powerful. A single victory would not end the war. Only days later, Washington made another bold move. He returned to New Jersey and faced British forces again near Princeton. The Battle of Princeton became another important American success. The British were forced to withdraw from much of New Jersey. Although the Continental Army had not destroyed the British military, it had achieved something equally valuable. It had changed the spirit of the war. The year 1776 had begun with uncertainty. It ended with renewed determination. Washington's army had survived its darkest season. The idea of independence, once considered impossible by many, now seemed within reach. As winter settled across the countryside, soldiers returned to their camps. They repaired equipment, shared meals, wrote letters home, and prepared for another year of fighting. Beyond the frozen fields, the world was watching. The rebellion that had begun as a protest against British policies had become a serious war for independence. The 13 colonies were no longer simply demanding changes. They were fighting to create something entirely new, a nation that had not yet fully taken shape, a nation whose future depended on courage, sacrifice, and the determination of ordinary people. And as the stars appeared above the quiet winter landscape, the American Revolution entered its next uncertain chapter. The year 1777 began with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had restored confidence among the American forces, but George Washington understood that the British Army remained a powerful opponent. The Continental Army still faced many challenges. Supplies were limited. Training was incomplete. Many soldiers lacked the experience needed for a long war. Yet the spirit of the army had changed. The men who remained believed that victory was possible. During the spring and summer of 1777, both sides prepared for another major campaign. The British developed a new strategy. Instead of focusing only on capturing cities, they planned to divide the colonies and isolate New England, which they considered the center of the rebellion. A key part of this plan involved gaining control of the Hudson River. If Britain could control that important waterway, they hoped to separate New England from the other colonies and weaken the American resistance. The British campaign was led by General John Bergen. He commanded a large army that moved south from Canada toward New York. The force included British regulars, German soldiers, indigenous allies, and loyalist supporters. Bergen believed his campaign would quickly succeed. At the same time, another British army under General William Howe moved toward Philadelphia. Philadelphia was not only an important city, but also the location of the Continental Congress. Capturing it would be a major symbolic victory for Britain. Washington understood the danger. He moved the Continental Army south to defend the city. In September 1777, the two armies met near Philadelphia at the Battle of Brandywine. It was the largest battle of the Revolutionary War up to that point. The fighting was intense. American soldiers defended their positions bravely, but the British used their experience and numbers to gain the advantage. Washington was forced to retreat. Soon afterward, British forces entered Philadelphia. The city was captured without a major battle. Members of Congress had already left for safety. Although Britain controlled the city, the victory did not end the rebellion. Washington and his army remained in the field. They moved to a place called Valley Forge for the winter. The name would become one of the most remembered locations in American history. The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge was incredibly difficult. The Continental Army arrived tired from months of campaigning. The soldiers built simple wooden huts to survive the cold. Snow covered the ground. Food supplies were often inadequate. Clothing shortages were severe. Many soldiers lacked proper coats, hats, blankets, and shoes. The famous story of soldiers leaving bloody footprints in the snow reflects the real hardships they faced, though details vary in historical accounts. Disease spread through the crowded camps. Illness was often more dangerous than battlefield wounds. Many soldiers became sick, some died. Despite these conditions, the army remained together. Washington faced criticism during this period. Some people questioned whether he was the right leader. Others blamed supply problems on government officials. The difficulties tested everyone's patience. But Washington continued working to improve the army. One of the most important changes came with the arrival of Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a military officer from Prussia. He volunteered to help train the Continental Army. At Valley Forge, von Steuben introduced European military techniques. He taught soldiers how to march properly, how to load and fire weapons more efficiently, how to organize battlefield movements. His training transformed the Continental Army. The soldiers who left Valley Forge were not the same group who had arrived months earlier. They were more disciplined, more organized, more confident. Meanwhile, the war itself was changing. Far away from the major battles in the east, American forces achieved an important victory in the north. Bergen's campaign toward the Hudson River had slowed. His army faced strong resistance from American troops led by generals such as Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. In October 1777, the Americans won a decisive victory at the Battle of Saratoga. Bergen's army was surrounded and eventually forced to surrender. The victory at Saratoga became a turning point. It showed the world that the American forces could defeat a major British army. Most importantly, it convinced France that the American cause had a real chance of success. Soon, France would enter the war as an official ally of the United States. The conflict that had begun as a rebellion against Britain was becoming an international war. As winter winds moved across the fields of Valley Forge, the soldiers continued their training. They repaired their weapons, strengthened their discipline, prepared for another year of fighting. The future remained uncertain, but the young American army had survived its hardest winter yet, and with a powerful new ally on the horizon, the struggle for independence was about to become far larger than anyone had imagined. The spring of 1778 arrived quietly at Valley Forge. The snow began to disappear. The frozen ground softened. Small signs of new life appeared across the fields surrounding the Continental Army's camp. But the soldiers who emerged from that difficult winter were changed. They were no longer simply a collection of local militias. They had become a more organized and disciplined army. Months of training under Baron von Steuben had created a stronger fighting force. The men could march together. They could follow commands more effectively. They could perform battlefield movements with greater confidence. George Washington looked across the camp and saw something that had not existed before, a true national army. Yet the biggest change of 1778 came from beyond the Atlantic Ocean. The American victory at Saratoga had convinced France that the rebellion had become a serious challenge to Britain. For years, France and Britain had been rivals. They had fought against each other in Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. Now, French leaders saw an opportunity. If the American colonies succeeded, Britain would lose a valuable part of its empire. In February 1778, France officially recognized the United States and signed treaties of alliance and friendship. This was a major moment in world history. The American Revolution was no longer a conflict between Britain and its colonies alone. It had become an international war. French support brought important advantages. France provided money, weapons, supplies, and military assistance. Most importantly, France had a powerful navy. Control of the seas would become one of the most important factors in the years ahead. When the British learned that France had joined the war, their strategy changed. They realized that fighting the Americans while also facing a powerful European enemy would be much more difficult. General William Howe was replaced as commander of British forces in America by General Henry Clinton. Clinton received new orders. The British Army would leave Philadelphia and return to New York. Washington immediately moved his army to follow. In June 1778, the two forces met in New Jersey at the Battle of Monmouth. The battle took place during intense summer heat. The temperature was extremely high, and many soldiers struggled under the burning sun. The fighting continued for hours across open fields. One of the most famous figures from the battle was Mary Ludwig Hayes, later remembered as Molly Pitcher. According to tradition, she carried water to soldiers and may have helped operate a cannon after her husband was injured. Stories about her have become part of American Revolutionary folklore. though historians continue studying the details of her exact actions. The Battle of Monmouth ended without a clear victory for either side. The British continued their movement toward New York. The Continental Army remained intact. Although it was not a decisive battle, it demonstrated that Washington's army could stand against experienced British forces in a major open-field fight. After Monmouth, the war entered a different phase. The British changed their focus toward the southern colonies. They believed that many loyalists lived there, and that support for Britain would help them regain control. The southern strategy began with an attack on Georgia. In late 1778, British forces captured Savannah. The following year, they moved against other important southern locations. The fighting in the south became extremely difficult. The landscape was different from the northern colonies. Large forests, rivers, and swamps created challenges for armies. Local militias carried out smaller attacks. Communities were divided between patriots and loyalists. Neighbors sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. The war was no longer only fought between large armies. It became a struggle that reached into farms, towns, and families. Meanwhile, the alliance with France continued growing stronger. French officers and soldiers arrived in America. French ships prepared for future operations. American leaders hoped that this partnership would finally provide the advantage needed to defeat Britain. But victory was still far away. The British Empire remained powerful. Its navy could move troops across the world. Its soldiers continued occupying important cities. The Continental Army still faced financial problems and supply shortages. As 1778 came to an end, many people wondered how much longer the war would continue. Families had already endured years of uncertainty. Farmers had lost harvests. Merchants had lost trade. Soldiers had spent years away from home. Yet the dream of independence remained alive. The struggle had entered a new and more complicated chapter. The next great battles would not only determine the future of America. They would test the strength, patience, and determination of everyone involved. And as the winter winds returned across the colonies, the fate of the young nation remained uncertain beneath the quiet evening sky. The year 1779 arrived with the American Revolution entering a difficult and uncertain stage. The excitement of earlier victories had faded. The war that many people once believed might end quickly had continued for years. Families across the colonies were beginning to feel the long weight of conflict. Farmers struggled to produce enough food. Merchants faced disrupted trade. Governments faced financial problems. Soldiers faced another year away from their homes. Yet the fight for independence continued. The British strategy in the South became the center of attention. British leaders believed that the southern colonies contained many loyalists who would support the crown if British forces arrived. They hoped that by capturing important cities and encouraging loyalist support, they could regain control of the region. After capturing Savannah, Georgia, British forces turned their attention toward South Carolina. The city of Charleston became a major target. Its busy harbor, wealthy merchants, and strategic location made it extremely valuable. Throughout 1779 and early 1780, British forces prepared a major campaign against the city. Meanwhile, American leaders attempted to strengthen their defenses. General Benjamin Lincoln was placed in command of the Southern Continental forces. He understood the importance of protecting Charleston, but the situation was extremely challenging. Supplies were limited. The British Navy controlled nearby waters. The American Army lacked the strength needed for a long defense. In the spring of 1780, the British surrounded Charleston. Their ships blocked the harbor. Their soldiers approached from land. The city was gradually cut off from outside assistance. For weeks, American defenders held their positions. But as the siege continued, their situation became increasingly hopeless. On May 12, 1780, Charleston surrendered. It was one of the worst defeats suffered by the American forces during the entire war. Thousands of Continental soldiers became prisoners. The British gained control of a major southern city. The victory encouraged British leaders, who believed their southern strategy was working. But the reality was more complicated. Although the British captured important locations, they discovered that controlling the countryside was far more difficult. Many Patriot militias continued fighting. Small groups attacked British supply lines. Local commanders organized resistance. The war in the South became a difficult struggle across forests, farms, and small communities. One of the most important American leaders during this period was Nathanael Greene. In late 1780, Greene took command of the Southern Continental Army. He understood that he could not defeat the British in one large battle. Instead, he used a strategy of movement, patience, and careful pressure. He divided his forces. He forced the British to spread their troops across a wide region. He relied on smaller victories that slowly weakened the enemy. Another important figure in the Southern campaign was Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox. Marion led Patriot fighters through the difficult landscapes of South Carolina. Using knowledge of local forests and waterways, his forces carried out surprise attacks and quickly disappeared before larger British units could respond. These kinds of actions made it extremely difficult for Britain to secure complete control. At the same time, the war continued elsewhere. The American economy faced serious challenges. The Continental Congress struggled to pay soldiers and purchase supplies. Inflation increased as more paper currency was printed. Many people wondered whether the new government could survive the enormous demands of war. Despite these difficulties, ordinary people continued supporting the cause. Women managed farms while husbands and sons served in the army. Craftsmen produced supplies. Communities collected food and clothing. Enslaved and free African Americans also played important roles during the war, serving in various military and support positions. While the conflict also raised difficult questions about freedom and slavery that would remain unresolved for generations. The year 1779 also saw another major international development. The conflict expanded beyond North America. Britain found itself fighting not only American forces, but also France and, eventually, other European powers. The British Empire had to protect interests across the globe. The war was becoming more expensive and complicated. By the end of the decade, neither side had achieved a decisive victory. Britain controlled major cities. America controlled much of the countryside. The French alliance gave the Americans important support, but the final outcome remained uncertain. As another year passed, soldiers prepared for more battles. Families hoped for peace. Leaders searched for new strategies. The young nation continued struggling toward an uncertain future. And in the distance, another major confrontation was approaching, one that would take place in the southern fields of the Carolinas and eventually bring the war closer to its final chapter. The year 1780 brought some of the hardest moments of the American Revolution. The war in the South grew more intense. The British had achieved an important victory by capturing Charleston, but holding the region proved far more difficult than they expected. Across the countryside of South Carolina and Georgia, Patriot resistance continued. The forests, rivers, and swamps became places where small groups of fighters could challenge a larger army. The British had captured cities, but they struggled to control the land beyond them. Meanwhile, the Continental Army faced its own serious problems. The long years of war had exhausted many soldiers. Some had not been paid for months. Supplies remained limited. Clothing and food shortages continued. Even officers struggled with the challenges of keeping an army together. George Washington watched these difficulties with concern. He understood that courage alone could not win the war. A nation fighting for independence needed resources, allies, and patience. One of the greatest sources of hope remained the alliance with France. French support had already provided weapons, money, and military assistance. Now, the possibility of cooperation between French and American forces offered a new opportunity. 1780, a French military force led by Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Weimar, Comte de Rochambeau, arrived in Rhode Island. The arrival of French troops brought renewed optimism. For the first time, American and French commanders could seriously plan a combined operation against the British. However, success would not come immediately. The British still occupied important cities, including New York. Their navy remained one of the strongest in the world. The war continued to demand enormous sacrifice. During this difficult period, one of the most shocking events of the Revolution unfolded. The name was Benedict Arnold. Earlier in the war, Arnold had been considered one of America's most talented military leaders. He had shown remarkable courage at battles such as Saratoga. Many believed he deserved greater recognition. But over time, Arnold became increasingly frustrated. He felt that Congress had not rewarded him properly. He faced financial problems. His personal disagreements with other officers grew stronger. Slowly, he began secretly communicating with British officials. Arnold eventually accepted a command at West Point, a critical American fort on the Hudson River. His plan was to surrender the position to the British in exchange for money and a high-ranking position in their army. The plot was discovered when British Major John Andre was captured carrying documents revealing the plan. Arnold escaped before he could be arrested. He fled to the British side and joined their army. The betrayal shocked the American public. A man once considered a hero had become a symbol of disloyalty. For many soldiers who had sacrificed everything for independence, Arnold's actions were deeply painful. Yet the revolution continued. In the South, American forces slowly began recovering from earlier defeats. General Nathanael Greene took command and began using careful strategies to weaken British control. Instead of seeking one massive confrontation, Greene forced the British to fight a difficult campaign across a large area. One important battle occurred at Kings Mountain in October 1780. American Patriot forces defeated a Loyalist militia group led by Major Patrick Ferguson. The victory strengthened Patriot confidence in the South. It showed that British-supported forces could be defeated even in regions where Britain seemed powerful. As winter approached, the war entered another uncertain phase. The conflict had already lasted longer than many people expected. Thousands had died. Communities had been damaged. Families had endured years of separation. Yet the desire for independence remained strong. The world was also changing. Britain faced pressure from multiple enemies. France continued fighting alongside America. Spain had entered the conflict against Britain. The British Empire was now involved in a much larger global struggle. Every decision became more complicated. Every battle carried greater consequences. Back in the American camps, soldiers continued preparing. They repaired weapons, trained new recruits, waited for opportunities. They did not know exactly when the war would end. They only knew that the final outcome depended on endurance. As the cold winds of winter moved across the colonies, the future remained uncertain. But slowly, events were moving toward a decisive moment. Far away in the southern countryside, American and British forces were preparing for battles that would determine the direction of the war. And soon, a young nation would face one of its greatest tests, a final struggle that would decide whether independence would become a dream or a reality. The year 1781 began with the American Revolution approaching a turning point. After years of fighting, both sides were exhausted. The British still controlled important cities and had a powerful navy. The Continental Army had survived incredible hardships but remained dependent on careful planning and the support of its allies. The war had become a test of endurance. In the southern colonies, General Nathanael Greene continued his strategy of wearing down British forces. He understood that the American army did not need to win every battle. It needed to survive long enough for circumstances to change. Greene moved his troops through the countryside, forcing the British to chase him across difficult terrain. Each movement required patience. Each decision required careful judgment. One of the most important confrontations came at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina on March 15. 1,781 British forces were commanded by General Charles Cornwallis. The Americans were led by Nathanael Greene. The battle was intense. The Continental Army and militia forces fought from carefully prepared positions. The British eventually forced the Americans to retreat, but the victory came at a heavy cost. Cornwallis lost a significant portion of his army. The battle demonstrated an important reality. Even when Britain won on the battlefield, the price could be extremely high. The British army was becoming weaker with every difficult campaign. Meanwhile, the American forces were becoming more experienced. Across the South, Patriot resistance continued. Small groups of fighters challenged British movements. Supply lines became harder to protect. The countryside remained unpredictable. The British could capture towns, but they could not easily control the people living beyond them. At the same time, a major plan was developing between American and French commanders. George Washington and French General Rochambeau began considering a campaign that could potentially end the war. Their attention turned toward British forces under General Cornwallis, who had moved his army into Virginia. Cornwallis had established a position at Yorktown, located near the Chesapeake Bay. The location seemed strong. The harbor allowed British ships to bring supplies. The surrounding land provided defensive advantages. Cornwallis believed the position could be held, but he did not realize that American and French forces were preparing a carefully coordinated operation. The first part of the plan depended on the French Navy. Control of the waters around Virginia would be essential. If British ships could reach Yorktown, Cornwallis might receive reinforcements or escape. In September 1781, a French fleet commanded by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. The French Navy defeated British ships attempting to regain control of the area. This victory was crucial. Yorktown was now isolated. Meanwhile, Washington and Rochambeau moved thousands of American and French soldiers south from New York. The movement was carefully planned. Thousands of troops marched hundreds of miles. Supplies were transported. Communications were coordinated. By the end of September, the combined army surrounded Yorktown. Inside the town, Cornwallis realized that he faced a serious challenge. American and French forces began building siege lines closer and closer to the British defenses. Engineers constructed trenches. Artillery positions were created. Cannons were brought forward. The sound of digging filled the night air. The siege became a battle of patience. Each side waited. Each side calculated. The American and French forces slowly tightened their control. Heavy artillery fire struck British positions. The defenders attempted to hold their lines, but their situation became increasingly difficult. Food supplies decreased. The number of wounded soldiers grew. The possibility of escape became smaller every day. Cornwallis hoped that a British rescue fleet might arrive. But without control of the bay, that hope faded. By October, the British position had become extremely difficult. The final stage of the siege was approaching. On October 14, American and French forces captured important defensive positions known as Redoubts 9 and 10. The attack was carefully planned. American troops under Alexander Hamilton played a major role in capturing Redoubt 10. The success allowed the Allies to move their artillery even closer to the British lines. The pressure became overwhelming. General Cornwallis had few options left. The army that had once marched confidently through the southern colonies was now surrounded. The future of the American Revolution was resting on the quiet fields of Virginia. Soon, a formal surrender would take place. And although the war itself would not officially end for another 2 years, the events at Yorktown would convince many people that the struggle for American independence had reached its decisive moment. The morning of October 19, 1781, arrived quietly over the fields of Yorktown, Virginia. The autumn air was cool. The trees surrounding the battlefield had begun changing colors. The sounds of war that had filled the area for weeks were slowly fading. After a long and exhausting siege, the moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. General Charles Cornwallis had surrendered his army. The British forces at Yorktown were defeated. For the American and French soldiers who had spent weeks building trenches, carrying supplies, and enduring constant danger, the victory felt almost impossible to believe. The surrender ceremony was carefully arranged. British soldiers marched out of Yorktown in formation. Their weapons were lowered. Their flags were carried with solemn respect. The defeated army passed before the victorious American and French forces. According to tradition, Cornwallis claimed illness and did not personally attend the ceremony. Instead, his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, represented him. The moment was symbolic. The British Empire, one of the most powerful empires in the world, had suffered a major defeat at the hands of a young nation still fighting for recognition. But Yorktown did not immediately end the war. Battles continued in other parts of the world. British and American forces still faced each other in several locations. However, the political situation had changed dramatically. News of Cornwallis's surrender reached Britain several weeks later. Many British leaders began questioning whether continuing the war was worth the enormous cost. The conflict had become expensive. It had damaged trade. It had created political divisions at home. The dream of quickly defeating the rebellion had disappeared. Across America, the reaction was very different. People celebrated. Church bells rang in towns and villages. Crowds gathered in streets. Families shared the news with excitement and relief. After years of sacrifice, many believed peace was finally approaching. Yet the soldiers who had fought the war still faced uncertainty. The Continental Army remained in service. Many soldiers were still waiting for promised payments. Some worried about what would happen after they returned home. They had spent years fighting for a new nation. Now they had to help build one. George Washington faced an important responsibility. He had become one of the most respected figures in America. Some people admired him so greatly that they imagined giving him even more power. But Washington believed the military should remain under civilian control. He did not want to become a ruler. He wanted the new nation to be based on principles of self-government. This decision would become one of the most important examples of leadership in American history. In 1783, peace negotiations began between the United States and Great Britain. Representatives from both sides met in Paris. The final agreement became known as the Treaty of Paris. The treaty officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. Britain acknowledged that the former colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. The new United States gained territory stretching west to the Mississippi River. The war that had begun with protests over taxes had created an entirely new country. But independence brought new questions. How would this nation govern itself? How would the states work together? How would debts from the war be paid? How would leaders protect the rights they had fought to defend? Winning independence had been difficult. Building a stable nation would prove just as challenging. In late 1783, British forces finally left New York City, one of their last major positions. The streets that had once been filled with soldiers and uncertainty became peaceful again. On December 4, Washington gathered with his officers at Fraunce's Tavern. The moment was emotional. These men had shared years of hardship. They had fought battles together. They had lost friends together. Now they faced the reality that their journey was ending. Washington said goodbye to his officers, and many struggled to hold back tears. Soon afterward, he traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, where he formally resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The act surprised many observers. Throughout history, victorious generals often used military power to gain political control. Washington chose a different path. He returned power to civilian leaders. He returned to private life. His decision sent a powerful message about the kind of nation the United States hoped to become. As the year ended, a new chapter began. The 13 former colonies were now an independent country. Their flag represented a new identity. Their government was still developing. Their future was uncertain. But the people had achieved something extraordinary. They had challenged one of the world's strongest empires and created a new nation. The story of America was only beginning. And beneath the quiet winter sky, the young republic prepared for the next great challenge. Not winning independence, but learning how to preserve it. After the celebrations of independence faded, the people of the United States faced a reality that was far more complicated than many had expected. Winning the war had been an extraordinary achievement, but creating a successful nation required something entirely different. The 13 states were independent, but they were also deeply connected. They shared a common struggle. They had fought together. They had sacrificed together. Yet they still had different interests, different economies, and different ideas about the future. The first national government created after independence was known as the Articles of Confederation. The system reflected the fears many Americans had developed during their conflict with Britain. They worried that a powerful central government might become too much like the monarchy they had just rejected. So the Articles created a very limited national government. The states held most of the power. Congress could make decisions about national issues, but it had difficulty enforcing those decisions. It could not easily collect taxes. It could not directly regulate trade between states. It had limited ability to respond quickly during national emergencies. At first, many people appreciated this arrangement. After years of fighting against distant authority, protecting local control seemed important. But problems soon appeared. The new country owed large amounts of money from the war. Soldiers and suppliers needed payment. The national government struggled to raise funds. Different states created different trade rules. Economic disagreements increased. Some leaders began worrying that the United States might become weak and divided. One of the most serious challenges occurred in the late 1780s with Shays' Rebellion. In Massachusetts, many farmers faced heavy debts and high taxes after the war. Some had served in the Revolutionary War but returned home to financial difficulties. When courts began taking action against debtors, groups of angry farmers organized protests. Led by Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army officer, the movement eventually became an armed uprising. The rebellion was eventually stopped, but it worried many leaders. To them, it showed that the national government lacked the strength needed to maintain order. A question began spreading among political thinkers. Could the United States survive with such a weak central government? In 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. Officially, their purpose was to improve the Articles of Confederation. But the discussion soon became much larger. The delegates began designing an entirely new system of government. Among the most influential figures at the convention were George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. Washington served as president of the convention. Madison played a major role in developing many of the ideas that shaped the new Constitution. Franklin, one of the oldest delegates, brought experience and wisdom from decades of public service. Hamilton argued strongly for a stronger national government. The delegates debated difficult questions. How much power should the national government have? How should states be represented? How could leaders be chosen? How could individual freedoms be protected? One major disagreement involved representation. Large states wanted representation based on population. Smaller states feared losing their influence. The debate was eventually solved through the Great Compromise. Congress would have two parts. The House of Representatives would be based on population. The Senate would give every state equal representation. This structure became one of the foundations of American government. Another difficult issue involved slavery. The delegates faced deep disagreements over the institution. The Constitution included compromises that protected slavery in several ways, including agreements over representation and trade. These decisions allowed the Constitution to gain approval at the time, but they left unresolved conflicts that would continue to shape American history for generations. After months of debate, the delegates completed the Constitution in September 1787, but the document did not automatically become law. It needed approval from the states. Supporters, known as Federalists, argued that the Constitution created a stronger and more effective government. Opponents, called Anti-Federalists, worried that the new system might become too powerful and threaten individual freedoms. The debate spread throughout the country. Newspapers published essays. Citizens gathered in meetings. Letters traveled between communities. People carefully considered what kind of nation they wanted to create. Eventually, enough states approved the Constitution, and the new government prepared to begin. In 1789, George Washington was chosen as the first president of the United States. The same man who had led the Continental Army during the Revolution now faced a completely different mission. He was no longer commanding soldiers. He was helping build a government. The young republic had survived the war. Now it had to prove that a nation built on self-government could truly succeed. As Washington traveled to New York City for his inauguration, crowds gathered along the roads to see him. The future of America was still uncertain, but a new era had begun. The revolutionary generation had won independence. Now they faced the even greater challenge of creating a lasting nation. The spring of 1789 marked a new beginning for the United States. The war for independence was over. The Constitution had been approved. The people had chosen their first president. Now the young nation faced the difficult task of turning ideas written on paper into a functioning government. On April 30, 1789, George Washington stood on a balcony in New York City and took the presidential oath of office. The ceremony was simple compared with modern inaugurations. There were no massive stages, no television cameras, no national celebrations reaching millions of people. Yet the moment carried enormous meaning. A former military commander was peacefully transferring his leadership into a civilian government chosen under a new constitution. Washington understood that every decision he made would set an example for future presidents. The nation was watching. The world was watching. The first president had no previous example to follow. There was no long tradition of American government, no established rules for presidential behavior. Washington had to create many customs himself. He carefully considered everything, from how he greeted visitors to how he worked with Congress. He wanted the presidency to have enough dignity to command respect, but not so much power that it resembled a monarchy. One of Washington's first challenges was building the government itself. The Constitution had created the structure, but many details still needed to be organized. Congress established important departments. Washington selected trusted advisors to help manage national affairs. Among them was Alexander Hamilton, who became the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed the United States needed a strong financial system. The country carried significant debts from the Revolutionary War. Many soldiers, merchants, and foreign governments were still waiting for payment. Hamilton proposed that the federal government take responsibility for national and state war debts. He believed this would strengthen the country's credit and increase confidence in the new government. This plan created debate. Some leaders supported Hamilton's ideas. Others worried that a stronger financial system would give the federal government too much power. One of Hamilton's strongest opponents was Thomas Jefferson, who became Secretary of State. Jefferson believed in a more limited federal government and greater power for individual states and farmers. The disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson reflected a larger debate that would shape American politics for generations. What kind of nation should the United States become? Should it focus on commerce, industry, and a strong national government? Or should it remain centered around independent farmers and local communities? These questions did not have simple answers. Both visions represented important hopes for America's future. During Washington's presidency, another important institution was created. The First National Bank of the United States was established. Supporters argued that it would help manage government finances and encourage economic growth. Opponents questioned whether the Constitution gave the federal government that authority. The debate revealed something important. Even among people who supported the new nation, there were different ideas about its direction. Political disagreements became more organized. Groups began forming around different beliefs. These early divisions eventually developed into America's first political parties. At the same time, the United States faced challenges beyond its borders. European nations were watching the new republic carefully. Some hoped it would succeed. Others doubted whether a government created after a revolution could survive. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, created another complicated situation. France had helped America during its own struggle for independence. Many Americans felt sympathy toward the French people. However, the conflict between France and Britain created difficult choices for the United States. Washington believed the young country needed time to grow stronger. He wanted to avoid becoming involved in European wars. In 1793, he announced a policy of neutrality. The decision was controversial. Some praised it as wise and necessary. Others believed America should support France because of the alliance during the Revolutionary War. But Washington remained focused on protecting the future of the United States. He believed peace would allow the nation to develop. During his presidency, the country also faced challenges from within. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania protested a federal tax on whiskey. The disagreement became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington responded by sending troops to enforce federal law. The rebellion ended without a major battle, but the event demonstrated something important. Unlike the weak government under the Articles of Confederation, the new Constitution had created a national government capable of responding to challenges. By the end of Washington's first term, the United States had begun building its institutions. Courts were operating, departments were functioning, financial systems were developing. The nation was still small and fragile, but it was proving that self-government could work. As Washington entered his second term, Americans continued debating the future. The country was no longer fighting for independence. Now it was fighting a different kind of battle, the struggle to define what independence truly meant. And beneath the quiet evening sky of the young republic, a new chapter of American history was unfolding. As the 1790s continued, the United States entered a period of growth, uncertainty, and important decisions. The nation was still young. Many people around the world wondered whether this experiment in self-government could survive. For centuries, most countries had been ruled by kings, queens, and powerful families. The idea that ordinary citizens could create and maintain their own government was still something new. Inside America, disagreements about the future became stronger. The debates between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson represented two different visions for the country. Hamilton believed the United States needed strong financial institutions, a powerful central government, and a growing economy based on trade and industry. Jefferson believed the nation should protect the independence of farmers, limit federal power, and preserve strong state governments. Both men cared deeply about the future of America. They simply imagined different paths. These disagreements eventually created America's first political parties. Hamilton's supporters became known as Federalists. They favored a stronger national government and closer economic connections with merchants and businesses. Jefferson's supporters became known as Democratic Republicans. They emphasized individual liberty, agricultural communities, and limited federal authority. Political debates became increasingly intense. Newspapers across the country published arguments from both sides. Citizens gathered in taverns and town meetings to discuss the issues. The young republic was discovering that freedom also meant disagreement. In 1796, George Washington decided not to seek a third term as president. His decision created an important tradition. He believed that leaders should not hold power indefinitely. Before leaving office, he delivered his famous farewell address. In it, he warned Americans about the dangers of extreme political divisions and becoming too closely connected to foreign conflicts. Washington retired to his home at Mount Vernon, Virginia. The nation lost its first president, but his example continued influencing American leaders. The election of 1796 brought a peaceful transfer of power between different political groups. John Adams, a Federalist and longtime Patriot leader, became the second president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, his political opponent, became vice president. It was a unique situation. The two men represented competing visions for America, yet both had played important roles in creating the nation. President Adams faced serious challenges almost immediately. Relations with France became increasingly difficult. Many Americans still remembered France's support during the Revolutionary War, but the French Revolution had created a dangerous international situation. European powers were fighting, and American ships became caught in the tensions between France and Britain. French officials began interfering with American trade. In response, Adams sent diplomats to negotiate. The mission became known as the XYZ Affair. American representatives reported that French agents demanded payments before negotiations could continue. The news caused anger throughout the United States. Many Americans called for a stronger response against France. The country prepared for the possibility of war. A small naval conflict developed between the two nations, sometimes called the Quasi-War. Although no official war was declared, American and French ships clashed at sea. The situation created fear that the young republic might be pulled into a major international conflict. At home, political tensions increased. Federalists believed strong action was necessary to protect the country. Democratic Republicans worried that some government actions threatened individual freedoms. In 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Supporters argued that the laws protected national security. Critics argued that they restricted freedom of speech and were used to silence political opponents. The debate became one of the first major conflicts over the balance between government power and individual rights. As the election of 1800 approached, the political struggle became intense. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson competed for the presidency. The campaign revealed deep divisions within the young nation. Newspapers attacked opponents. Citizens argued passionately about the direction America should take. When the votes were counted, the result was extremely close. Jefferson and Aaron Burr received the same number of electoral votes, sending the decision to the House of Representatives. After many rounds of voting, Thomas Jefferson was chosen as the third president. The peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another became known as the Revolution of 1800. It was not a violent revolution. It was a political one. The government changed hands through elections rather than through conflict. For many observers, it proved that the American system could survive serious disagreements. As Jefferson prepared to lead the country, the United States stood at the beginning of a new century. The nation had survived its first challenges. It had created a government. It had established traditions. But the future still held enormous questions. How far would America expand? How would it balance freedom and power? How would it handle the difficult issues that remained unresolved? The 19th century was approaching, and with it would come a new era of exploration, expansion, conflict, and transformation that would shape the United States forever. The beginning of the 19th century brought a new feeling across the United States. The young republic was no longer the fragile nation it had been during the first years after independence. Its government had survived political disagreements. Its economy was slowly growing. Its population was increasing. Across the countryside, new communities were appearing. Roads stretched farther into the wilderness. Small towns became centers of trade. Many Americans believed the nation had a great future ahead. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. His inauguration represented something remarkable. For the first time in American history, power had peacefully transferred from one political party to another. Jefferson believed government should remain close to ordinary citizens. He wanted a simpler style of leadership. He reduced some formal traditions that had developed during Washington and Adams's presidencies. To Jefferson, the strength of America came from independent people, especially farmers who owned their own land. During his presidency, Jefferson focused on reducing government expenses and protecting individual freedoms. However, one of the greatest events of his administration came from an unexpected opportunity. For years, the United States had depended on access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans for Western trade. Farmers in the Western territories needed this route to move their products to international markets. When France regained control of Louisiana from Spain, many American leaders became concerned. France was a powerful European nation. If France controlled New Orleans and the vast territory west of the Mississippi, it could threaten American interests. Jefferson sent representatives to negotiate with France. The Americans originally hoped to purchase New Orleans, but French leader Napoleon Bonaparte had different plans. Napoleon was preparing for conflicts in Europe and realized that maintaining control of North America would be difficult. In 1803, France offered to sell not only New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. The opportunity was enormous. For approximately $15 million, the United States purchased a vast region stretching from the Mississippi River westward toward the Rocky Mountains. The Louisiana Purchase nearly doubled the size of the country. Many Americans celebrated the agreement, but the decision also created a constitutional question. Jefferson believed strongly in following the Constitution carefully, yet the Constitution did not clearly state that a president had the power to purchase such a massive territory. The president chose to move forward because he believed the opportunity was too important to lose. The new land opened possibilities for exploration and settlement. Jefferson wanted Americans to learn more about this enormous region. He selected Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead an expedition across the Western Territory. Their journey became one of the most famous explorations in American history. In 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition began. The team traveled through unfamiliar landscapes. They crossed rivers, mountains, and vast plains. They recorded plants, animals, geography, and information about indigenous nations they encountered. One of the important members of the expedition was Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who helped guide the group and communicate with local communities. The expedition lasted more than 2 years. When Lewis and Clark returned, they brought back valuable knowledge about the Western lands. Their journey increased American interest in expansion. However, westward growth also created serious conflicts. The land was not empty. Indigenous nations had lived across these territories for thousands of years. The arrival of American settlers brought new relationships, but also disagreements, pressure, and displacement. The history of expansion would become one of the most complicated parts of the American story. During Jefferson's presidency, another challenge appeared on the seas. Britain and France were once again at war in Europe. Both countries interfered with American shipping. American sailors were captured and forced into foreign service, especially by Britain through a practice known as impressment. The issue created anger among Americans. Many believed the nation's independence was being threatened. In 1812, tensions finally led to another major conflict. The United States declared war on Britain. The War of 1812 began. The young nation faced a powerful enemy once again. Britain had one of the world's strongest navies. Its military had years of experience. The United States, however, had grown stronger since the Revolutionary War. American soldiers and sailors prepared for another struggle to defend their independence. The war would bring dramatic battles. It would test the country's confidence, and it would create new heroes whose names would become part of American history. As the nation moved into the second decade of the 19th century, the story of America entered another uncertain chapter. The Republic was expanding. Its people were dreaming of a larger future. But that future would require courage, sacrifice, and difficult choices. The War of 1812 began as a conflict between the United States and Great Britain, but for many Americans, it became a test of whether their young nation could truly defend itself. The causes of the war were complicated. American leaders were angry about Britain's interference with American trade and the capture of American sailors. Many Americans believed Britain was treating the United States as if it were still a colony. There were also tensions along the western frontier, where some Americans believed Britain was supporting indigenous resistance against American expansion. In June 1812, President James Madison, who had succeeded Thomas Jefferson, asked Congress to declare war against Britain. The decision was controversial. Not everyone in America supported the war. Some merchants feared that fighting Britain would damage trade. Others believed the country was not prepared for another major conflict. The United States was still a young nation. Its army was small. Its navy was limited. Britain, meanwhile, was already fighting a massive war against Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe. Many American leaders believed this was the perfect moment to challenge British power. The first years of the war were difficult for the United States. American attempts to invade Canada failed. Several military campaigns ended in disappointment. The British forces were experienced, and many American soldiers were still learning how to fight large battles. But the war also produced moments of courage and determination. American naval victories surprised many observers. Small American ships achieved victories against larger British vessels. One famous example was the battle between the American ship USS Constitution and the British ship HMS Guerriere in 1812. The USS Constitution earned the nickname Old Ironsides because British cannonballs appeared to bounce off its strong wooden sides. The victory became a symbol of American naval pride. On land, new leaders began gaining recognition. One of them was Andrew Jackson, a military commander who became famous for his strong personality and battlefield success. In the southern region, Jackson led American forces against the Creek Nation during conflicts connected to the broader war. The struggle was complicated, involving different groups with different interests. The war affected many indigenous nations, and many communities faced difficult choices as American and British forces competed for influence. By 1814, the situation became more serious for the United States. Napoleon had been defeated in Europe, allowing Britain to send more military resources to North America. British forces launched stronger attacks. In August 1814, British troops entered Washington, D.C. The American capital was poorly defended. British soldiers burned several public buildings, including the White House and the Capitol. The destruction shocked Americans. The city that represented the new republic had been attacked. Yet, even during this difficult moment, another important event was taking place. In Baltimore, American forces defended Fort McHenry against a British naval attack. The battle lasted through the night. From a ship in the harbor, lawyer and poet Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment. When morning arrived, he saw the American flag still flying above the fort. The sight inspired him to write the poem that later became the national anthem of the United States, the Star-Spangled Banner. War continued into 1815, but both sides were becoming tired of the fighting. Peace negotiations had already begun. The result was the Treaty of Ghent. Signed in December 1814, the treaty ended the war and restored relations between the United States and Britain. Interestingly, news of the treaty traveled slowly. A major battle was fought after the treaty had already been signed because the armies had not yet received the message. That battle took place in New Orleans. On January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson led American forces to a dramatic victory against the British. The Battle of New Orleans became one of the most famous American victories of the war. Although it happened after peace had been agreed upon, it created a powerful sense of national pride. After the War of 1812, many Americans felt a renewed confidence. The country had survived another conflict with Britain. It had defended its independence. It had proven that the United States could stand among the nations of the world. The years after the war became known as the era of good feelings. National pride increased. Economic growth accelerated. New roads and canals connected communities. The country expanded westward. But beneath this peaceful surface, important disagreements were growing. Questions about slavery, states' rights, and expansion were becoming harder to ignore. The United States was growing larger and stronger, but the choices it made in the coming decades would determine what kind of nation it would become. As the young republic entered a new era, the American story continued, filled with ambition, discovery, conflict, and transformation.